Shadows lengthened across the red keep as the new day's sun began to wane, painting the storm-battered walls with streaks of gold and crimson. Joffrey Baratheon, once a self-styled king, now languished under close guard, stripped of finery and forced into a cramped chamber where a single, flickering torch cast twisted shadows on the stone walls. Cersei Lannister had been confined likewise, pacing like a restless lioness in a separate tower. The Iron Throne, its spines of melted swords capturing the lingering dusk, stood empty for the moment. Stannis Baratheon, soon to be crowned by his priests, had withdrawn to confer with his most trusted advisors, while Robb Stark and his northern bannermen controlled key segments of the city's defenses. The capital was subdued, frightened. Word had spread that the Lannisters were undone, that King Joffrey was no true king but a child born of incest, and that the real power in the city now lay with the king in the north and the man who named himself King of the Seven Kingdoms. There were, of course, pockets of chaos. Looters roamed certain alleys. Gold cloaks uncertain of their new loyalties wandered with uneasy stares. Small folk huddled in burnt-out hovels or by the high walls of the city, hoping the new rulers would spare them from further bloodshed. Jon Snow moved through the winding corridors of the Red Keep with Ghost padding at his side. The great white direwolf drew gazes of awe and fear from servants carrying linens and soldiers standing at attention. The beast was flecked with the grime and gore of battle, and no man was fool enough to stand in Ghost's way. Jon's expression was as somber as the aftermath of conquest demanded. He had never liked this castle. Too many memories of the day Ned Stark lost his head and Sansa Stark became a hostage of the crown. Now the halls seemed haunted by the echoes of that tragedy, though the occupant of the Iron Throne had changed. He was on his way to meet Robb in the Solar of Maegor's Holdfast, where the king in the north had been offered temporary quarters. Outside the door, Grey Wind lay stretched out, tongue lolling as he panted from exertion. At Jon's approach, the massive direwolf sniffed once, then let him pass. The door swung open, revealing Robb Stark in conversation with Lady Catelyn and Ser Brynden Tully, the Blackfish. Maps and dispatches lay strewn across a polished table. Robb's face was drawn from hours of battle and the flood of new responsibilities that had fallen on him. Nonetheless, he offered Jon a quick, grateful nod. "I'm glad you're here." Closed the door. "We need to speak about what's next." Jon did as he was bid, stepping into the chamber. He removed his gloves, tucking them into his belt, and took in the sight of his mother's lined brow and the Blackfish's keen gaze. Brynden Tully, silver hair pulled back neatly, was poring over a parchment that bore the wax seal of Stannis Baratheon. "There have been more letters," Lady Catelyn said by way of explanation. "From Dragonstone, from Lords of the Crownlands, and from Walder Frey." Her lips tightened around the last name. "What does Lord Walder want?" Jon asked, careful to keep his tone neutral. The alliance with House Frey was one of necessity, not one of heartfelt friendship. The Blackfish let out a short huff. To remind the king in the north that he kept his end of the deal. He did, after all, send men to fight in the war. Now he expects to be rewarded in lands, marriages, and coin. He's also making noises that we haven't lived up to the letter of all our new vows. You know how that old serpent can be. Jon grimaced. "We did sign the new treaty with him, giving him concessions. But I suppose it was naive to think he'd be content to wait long." Robb rubbed his temples. "We've barely sat down from one war, and we're beset on all sides by demands. Frey is just one of many, now that Stannis sits the Iron Throne. At least in name, he wants our official fealty, but by our agreement he must grant the North its independence. Meanwhile, Tywin Lannister is still at large. He might rally in the Westerlands or lure other houses to his cause. The war's not done, only changed." Jon glanced at the map spread out before them. The Crownlands, the Reach, the Westerlands, the Riverlands, the North, all carved up and at odds. "And what of the small folk here in the city?" he asked. "They're frightened, half-starved in some quarters. We should do something for them, else we risk riots." Catelyn reached out and touched Jon's hand gently. "Yes, we mustn't forget the people who suffer. My father always tried to protect the small folk of the Riverlands, and your father did the same in the north. Now, with the Lannisters overthrown, the least we can do is to bring them some measure of stability. Brynden Tully inclined his head. Stannis might not care much for the small folk beyond seeing them bow to him, but you can show them that the king in the north values justice. That might go a long way toward ensuring that if Tywin tries to retake the city, or sow chaos behind our lines, he'll find fewer sympathizers. Robb sighed. All good points. Let me speak to Stannis soon about feeding the city and re-establishing some semblance of order. If he won't, then I'll do it myself, at least in the districts where our men hold sway. Once we address that, we can turn our attention to Tywin. He turned his gaze to Jon. Where is Stannis now? He's in the throne room, Jon said. They're preparing some sort of coronation ceremony or anointment by his Red Priestess. The men are uneasy, even some of the Baratheon knights. They speak of R'hllor and sacrifices. Catelyn shuddered. I don't like the sound of that. We've aligned with Stannis for mutual gain, but I question the nature of his new faith. We'll need to stay vigilant. Robb rose from the table. Then let's not delay. We can't let him just do as he pleases without us. If he wants the throne, that's his matter, but the city is still brimming with northerners, and we have to protect our own interests. We'll go see him together, and then afterward, we'll decide how to respond to these letters. They left the Solar as a group, collecting a small escort of loyal Stark guards. Grey Wind and Ghost both followed, trailing at a respectful distance as they walked the corridors that led to the Great Hall. Outside, men were still sweeping debris from the final assault. Broken weapons, fallen banners, shattered doors. The smell of smoke lingered. Servants rushed about with anxious eyes, unsure whether they should kneel to Robb or to Stannis, uncertain which form of address was safest. When they entered the Great Hall, they found Stannis on the dais before the Iron Throne, conferring with Ser Davos Seaworth and Melisandre. Soldiers loyal to Baratheon stood watchfully around the perimeter, while a handful of gold cloaks who had hastily sworn new oaths lingered uncertainly near the back. Torches and iron sconces flickered, sending dancing shadows across the hall's pillars. Melisandre, robed in deep crimson, was as striking as ever, her hair like living fire. She turned her gaze upon the newcomers. "The king in the north arrives," she intoned, her voice smooth and resonant. "You come as foretold, with the direwolves at your side." Stannis himself was dressed in a dark tunic trimmed with the flaming heart of R'hllor. His jaw was set in a perpetual grim line. He acknowledged Robb with a curt nod. "You've come to see what's become of the city you helped conquer. Well, here it is, badly burned and battered, but in better shape than after the last siege. I hear you've been scouring the streets with your men, trying to keep order. That's good. I mean to rule over a realm of law, not ruin." Robb returned the nod. "I have thousands of northerners under my command, and they won't stand idle if the city falls to chaos. We supported your claim as we agreed, but there are matters we need to address. Provisions for the small folk, a stable gold cloak command, and the terms of the North's independence." Stannis's eyes flicked to Melisandre, then back to Robb. "Yes, the matter of independence. I told you I would recognize it if you aided me in taking the throne. I keep my word, though I do not like to see the realm fractured. The Red Woman says the fires have not foreseen a single kingdom, yet I will not renege." Melisandre smiled enigmatically. "In the light of the Lord, all may yet come to pass. The king in the north must do what he must, and the Lord of Dragonstone, the king of the Undulls, does what is required of him. In time, the flame reveals the truth." Catelyn's disquiet was obvious, but she held her tongue. She let Robb speak for them. Robb cleared his throat. "I appreciate your honoring the pact. However, there is still Tywin Lannister to consider. You've heard the reports. He might be gathering strength in the Westerlands, or seeking to hire Sellsword companies. We have a choice. Do we chase him down together and end this war once and for all, or do we let him fester and retaliate when we least expect it?" Ser Davos stepped forward. "Your Grace, if I may, my experience says it would be wise to coordinate with King Robb at least until Tywin is dealt with. A cornered lion is dangerous, especially when it still has gold to pay for knives in the dark. Stannis's lips thinned. I know, and it weighs on me that I have other concerns as well. The Tyrells, for one, who supported Joffrey and the Lannisters at the Blackwater. They have retreated to Highgarden, but their loyalty remains uncertain. The Vale and Dorne watch from afar, possibly waiting to see if they should join me or contest my rule. It's not as simple as riding west to burn out the last of the Lannisters. Robb placed a hand on the pommel of his sword. I'm not asking you to send every knight south or west, but a coordinated effort is best. If you can hold the capital with part of your forces, see to the Tyrell question, and keep your new seat, then let the rest ride with the north to put an end to Lannister power. Once that's done, you'll be freer to handle the rest of the realm, and I can secure my own lands in peace. Stannis studied him. I see the sense in it. Very well. Ser Davos, gather a portion of our men who will ride under the royal banner in support of the north. The rest remain here to secure the city and maintain order. If Tywin truly means to continue this war, I won't let him do so unchallenged. He turned his gaze to Jon Snow, as if noticing him for the first time in this conversation. You're Eddard Stark's son, the one who abandoned the Night's Watch. By rights, your head could be on a spike for desertion. But given these times, perhaps it was meant to be. You have done great deeds on the battlefield, if the rumors are to be believed. Jon held the older man's stare. I chose my family when my father was killed. The Night's Watch vow calls for no family and no land, but I could not stand aside. If you feel the need to punish me, I will face you. But it changes nothing about my decision. The Red Woman watched him with curious eyes, as though seeing some flicker in the flames. Stannis let out a dry noise that might have been the ghost of a laugh. I have bigger concerns now than punishing an oathbreaker. The North is allied with me, and that is the end of it. Just know that you owe me no further fealty, Jon Snow. My arrangement is with Robb Stark. Jon dipped his head. Understood. Satisfied, Stannis turned to the dais. Now I have little time for ceremony. My men demand a coronation, a formal anointing with the Lord of Light's blessing. That will occur soon. You are free to attend or not. The realm must see that a rightful king sits the Iron Throne at last. And then we will see to the matter of feeding the city, restoring order, and punishing those who would exploit the chaos. He gave a single nod, dismissing them. Robb, swallowing whatever retort or further questions he had, inclined his head in return. Lady Catelyn curtsied briefly, as was polite. They left with the Blackfish in tow, returning to the courtyard outside. The fresh air smelled faintly of smoke and the brine of Blackwater Bay. Well, Catelyn murmured, that's one matter decided. Stannis will give us a portion of his forces to help chase down Tywin, and he will recognize our independence, though I suspect he does so grudgingly. But I'll not complain if it spares us further conflict. Robb nodded. Yes, he may not be a warm ally, but he's an honest one. Still, we need to address the city's needs before we leave. We can't let them starve. If we do, we risk a rebellion that might undermine everything we worked for. With King's Landing stabilized, we can march west in force. They spent the next several days coordinating relief efforts in the city, dispatching wagons of food stored by the Lannisters and Tyrells from the stockpiles in the Red Keep. It was not enough to feed everyone fully, but it staved off immediate disaster. Robb instructed his men to maintain a presence in the city's districts, keeping looters at bay and punishing cutthroats swiftly. Stannis's gold cloaks looked on, uncertain whether to take cues from the Northerners or from their new king. Meanwhile, the Red Priests set up altars in certain squares, chanting prayers to Lawler and promising that the night was dark and full of terrors for those who opposed the new order. Jon found himself walking the streets each day, Ghost at his side, conferring with small folk, ensuring the rule of law was not replaced by tyranny. He saw the mistrust in their eyes, saw how they shrank from the direwolf's presence. Yet some whispered that if the Wolf King was anything like Ned Stark, they might see real justice at last. The memories of how Eddard Stark had tried to uncover the truth about Joffrey's parentage lingered in these streets. Many recalled how that quest for truth had ended on the steps of the Great September, in the execution of a just man. At night, Jon returned to the Red Keep, where the corridors felt no less haunted. Torchlight cast jagged shadows on the walls. Servants skirted away with fearful glances. On one such evening, he turned a corner to find himself face to face with Tyrion Lannister, or so it seemed at first. The man was short, with mismatched eyes, one green, one blackened with bruises. Only upon closer inspection did Jon realize it wasn't Tyrion at all, but some other dwarf, perhaps a jester or entertainer once in Joffrey's employ. He wore patched motley, and he looked terrified. "Mercy, sir," he stammered, stepping back. I was told to come get some scraps from the kitchens. I meant no harm." Jon softened his stance. "Be at ease. I'm not here to harm you. Go about your business. No one will stop you from getting a meal." The dwarf hesitated, trembling. "You look like him, like Lord Eddard Stark, they say. There's talk you're his son." "I am," Jon said quietly. "Now go, be safe." With a grateful nod, the dwarf hurried away. Jon watched him vanish into the gloom, feeling that curious pang of recognition that King's Landing was filled with lost souls, each with a story. He remembered Tyrion Lannister's kindness in the distant days when he still wore black at the wall. Where was Tyrion now? Some said he was forcibly exiled from King's Landing after Joffrey seized power and was last rumored to have fled to Essos or the Westerlands. Jon did not know, and he wasn't sure he cared. Tyrion had helped him once, but the man's family had brought ruin upon House Stark. As the days wore on, a hush fell across King's Landing. Stannis' coronation was held at sunrise, under the watchful eye of Melisandre, who recited strange words as she placed a golden crown wrought with the stag's head upon Stannis' brow. Robb and many other lords were in attendance, though few displayed outright joy. Even Davos looked somber. Melisandre claimed this was the dawn of a new era, that the Lord of Light had brought justice. If the crowd's subdued reaction was any indication, the city remained uncertain. But no open defiance reared its head. Too many swords ringed the plaza, ready for trouble. Later that evening, Robb convened a final gathering of his bannermen in the Red Keep's gardens. The great Jon was there, boisterous as ever, though the city had taken some of the wind out of his sails. Roose Bolton, pale-eyed and silent, lingered at the edges of the group. Lord Rickard Karstark had come, though a shadow of bitterness for his lost sons still haunted him. The recently arrived Manderleys, who had sailed down from White Harbor, mingled with Lannisters and Blackwoods from the Riverlands. Even the Frey contingent, led by Ser Ryman Frey, was present, though they seemed eager to press for more rewards now that the war had seemingly shifted in their favor. Robb stood at the center of a stone courtyard, arms folded. Torches sputtered in iron brackets, lighting the ring of faces. Gray wind prowled behind him, silent but imposing. Jon stood off to the side, near Lady Catelyn, listening. "My lords," Robb began, voice carrying the weight of command. "We have taken King's Landing alongside Stannis Baratheon. Joffrey and Cersei are locked away in dungeons, awaiting whatever justice Stannis and I decide. The city is no longer a threat to the north. But Tywin Lannister remains at large, and we owe it to ourselves, and to our slain kinsmen, to see this war ended properly. We cannot rest while the West can muster forces to strike at us." The great Jon roared his approval. "Aye, let's ride out and mount his head on a spike." Rickard Karstark nodded curtly. "There will be no peace until Tywin pays for the blood of my sons." Roose Bolton's mild tone cut through the rumblings. "We should consider caution, your grace. The Westerlands are rich in gold. Tywin can buy Sellswords if he cannot muster enough knights. If we overextend ourselves, we might lose all that we've gained. Perhaps we should hold here, fortify, let him come to us." Robb shook his head. "I have considered that, but Tywin will not come to King's Landing now that it's fully in Stannis' hands. He'd be riding into the jaws of defeat. Instead, he might fortify the Westerlands, build alliances, and strike at the Riverlands or the Reach. We should at least scout his positions, see if we can corner him quickly." Ser Ryman Frey cleared his throat. "If I may, your grace, My grandfather wonders if this is truly the time to chase Tywin into the Westerlands, which is well defended. The old man thinks we should press for a formal treaty with the Tyrells first, ensure they won't join Tywin. After all, the Tyrells still control a great many swords in the Reach. If we can keep them neutral or friendly, Tywin will be outnumbered. A murmur passed through the crowd. Catelyn lifted her chin. The Tyrells allied with the Lannisters at the Blackwater in another time, but they fled once it was clear Joffrey's cause was lost. Now they sit behind their walls in Highgarden. Perhaps they wait for terms from Stannis or from us. Brynden Tully frowned. They might want to see which way the wind truly blows. But remember, Mace Tyrell is proud. He won't bend the knee easily, not unless he sees great benefit. We have little to offer him now except the promise of peace. That might not be enough for him to risk Tywin's wrath. Robb exhaled heavily. Then we will send an envoy to Highgarden. Lord Manderley, you have a respectable name and a keen mind. Will you carry my letters to the Tyrells? See if they'll speak with us. Lord Wyman Manderley, portly with a thick white beard, bowed graciously. My pleasure, your grace. I will do my utmost to secure their neutrality, if not their open friendship. That's settled, Robb said. I plan to march within the fortnight. We will leave a northern garrison here, fewer in number, but enough to keep our presence. Stannis can handle the day-to-day governance of the city, but I refuse to abandon it entirely until this war is done. Volunteers for that post can speak to me privately. The rest of us will ride west cautiously. We'll use outriders to pick off Lannister supply lines, repeating our tactics at Harrenhal. If an opportunity arises to strike Tywin, we'll seize it. Otherwise, we'll contain him, starve him of allies, and force a negotiation if possible. Let the man see reason, or let him die by the sword. A chorus of agreement rose from the northern lords. The plan was set in broad strokes. The devil, as always, lay in the details, but Robb had proven he could adapt. The Red Wedding had never happened. Walder Frey was bought off with new marriages and small concessions. So the northern host remained intact, its leadership strong, its morale bolstered by the victory at King's Landing. The gathering soon dispersed, leaving Robb and Jon among the last to leave the courtyard. Jon paused on the threshold. It'll be good to march again, Robb. I feel uneasy in this city. Robb clasped his shoulder. Me too, brother. Our place is in the field, not behind these walls that hold too many ghosts. Once we root out the last of the Lannisters, we can go home, truly go home, to Winterfell. Then we'll worry about the North's future. They parted ways, each preparing for the next stage of the war. The next days passed in a flurry of logistics. Horses were shod, provisions loaded, ravens dispatched with instructions to remain alert for Tywin's movements. Stannis, for his part, stationed more gold cloaks at strategic posts and brought fresh men from Dragonstone to keep the peace. His Red Priestess prowled the halls, rumor whispering that she burned certain traitors at the stake in quiet corners of the city. Jon tried not to dwell on that. Finally, the appointed morning came. The northern host gathered in the broad avenue leading from the Red Keep, banners fluttering. Thousands of soldiers in furs and boiled leather stretched as far as the eye could see. The silver trout of Tully, the twin towers of Frey, and the wolf's head of Stark waved side by side. Robb rode at the front on a tall warhorse, gray wind loping beside him, the king in the North's crown glinting on his auburn curls. Jon was close behind, astride a dark courser, with Ghost keeping pace. The city watched them go in silence, uncertain whether to be grateful or afraid. Lady Catelyn had chosen to stay in King's Landing for the time being, partly to keep an eye on the prisoners Joffrey, Tommen, Myrcella, and Cersei. More than that, she wanted to ensure that if any fresh trouble flared between Stannis and the small folk, House Stark's interests would be represented. So Jon parted from her with a fond embrace, promising to keep Robb safe. They rode out of the city gates, crossing the Blackwater Rush on a wide stone bridge that was pitted and scarred from years of conflict. Ahead lay the King's Road that would eventually branch toward the Westerlands. The war drums pounded, and the men chanted the name of their king in the north, hearts burning with the pride of a recent triumph. Soon, The walls of King's Landing receded behind them. The air tasted cleaner, though the memory of blood and ruin lingered. Jon felt a weight lift from his shoulders. No matter what lay ahead, he preferred open country to the labyrinth of intrigues behind them. A few days' journey brought them to the rolling fields that separated the Crownlands from the Riverlands. Every so often, they passed a scorched farmstead or a ruined village, remnants of the earlier phases of the war. The people they encountered along the roads were wary but recognized the stark banners, some even offering cautious greetings. Robb made sure to keep the men disciplined, forbidding any pillaging or terrorizing of the locals. This won them some goodwill. Their outriders fanned out, collecting information about Lannister positions. Reports trickled in. Tywin had not yet shown his face in the field, but smaller pockets of Lannister loyalists roamed the borderlands, harrying travelers. There was also news of scattered bands of sellswords that might or might not be in Tywin's pay. As they drew closer to the Riverlands, the great Jon raised a cheer, for it felt like returning to friendlier ground. The men who had fought in those fields under Robb's banner recognized the terrain and the scattered villages that had once aided them. Many recalled the brutal campaigns that had raged from the Twins down to the fords of the Trident. But now, with Walder Frey technically on their side, crossing the rivers would not be such an ordeal. Riverrun itself welcomed them with open gates, Edmure Tully riding out to greet Robb. The castle still bore scars from Lannister assaults, but the Tully banners flew high. Edmure had heard of the victory in King's Landing and the uneasy alliance with Stannis. His face glowed with relief. "Your Grace," he said to Robb, offering a half-bow. "We waited anxiously for word of your success. The Riverlands are battered by war, but your presence brings hope. The small folk are weary. They want an end to this conflict. Can you give it to them?" Robb swung down from his horse. "That is my intention, Uncle. Tywin is all that stands in our way now. If we can corner him or force him to yield, the war might truly end." Edmure ushered them into Riverrun's courtyard. "We'll see you fed and rested. My sister remains in King's Landing, I hear?" Jon answered, dismounting. "Yes, she's keeping watch over certain matters in the Red Keep. She'll come north once we've seen this through." Edmure nodded. "Good. We'll keep her rooms ready." Inside the castle's great hall, Robb's lords gathered once more, strategizing the push west. They debated whether to march on Harrenhal first or bypass it. However, Harrenhal was already in friendly hands, garrisoned by the men they had left behind, so it made more sense to strike directly at the Westerland's borders. Rickard Karstark, face grim, spoke bluntly. "Tywin might be cowering in Casterly Rock. If we besiege it, we can end him. But that's a mighty fortress, as formidable as Harrenhal in its own way. We'll need enough men to encircle it, or we risk being pinned between the rock and the sea." The great Jon let out a rumbling laugh. "A direct siege might be the glorious path, but let's not forget that we can also lure him out. His pride won't allow him to remain behind walls forever, especially if we ravage Lannister lands. Let him come out to face us in open battle. There we'll have the advantage of morale." Jon kept silent at first, letting the older lord speak. Then Robb turned to him, eyebrows raised in question. "Jon." Jon chose his words carefully. "We succeeded at Harrenhal by using the castle to our advantage. But the Lannisters learned from that humiliation. If Tywin expects a siege, he'll stock Casterly Rock with enough supplies to outlast us, especially if he can still bring in gold or smugglers from the coast. We risk a long, grueling campaign. On the other hand, if we devastate the farmlands around the rock, cut off trade routes, and block key passes, we might starve him out or force him to meet us in battle. We should be prepared for sellswords or fleets bringing him provisions, though. He's cunning and has no shortage of coin." Roose Bolton, standing quietly, added, "A war of attrition is indeed one option. Yet we must weigh the cost in time and resources. Our men might grow weary, and winter could come. The last thing the North needs is to be caught far from home if the snows start falling in earnest." At that, the gathered lords exchanged uneasy looks. Westeros had a saying, "Winter is coming." It was the stark words, but it was also the literal truth. The seasons could last years, and the war had already caused famine in some areas. If a harsh winter settled in, armies might starve on the march. Robb set his jaw. Then we strike quickly. We move into the Westerlands, capturing key positions before winter takes hold. If we can corner Tywin or break his forces in a decisive engagement, that would be best. If that proves impossible, we'll look for a way to force negotiations. I'd rather see Tywin bend the knee or accept humiliating terms than waste more northern blood. The next day, they prepared to leave Riverrun. Edmure offered a portion of his Riverland knights to join the campaign, though many men were needed to defend the region against stray marauders. With that additional strength, Robb's host set off westward along the winding roads that led toward the Golden Tooth, the pass that served as a gateway to Lannister territory. During the march, Jon kept close watch on the men's morale. He had learned to sense when fear gnawed at their hearts or when hunger sapped their strength. So far, they were well provisioned, thanks to supply wagons from Riverrun and the spoils of King's Landing. But that wouldn't last indefinitely. He also noticed that some of the Frey men looked uneasy, though Ser Ryman Frey continued to posture with forced bravado. Jon found himself remembering his vow to marry a Frey, if needed, to mend the alliance. Walder Frey had not yet insisted upon it, but the possibility hovered in the background. He wondered if, once the war ended, the old man would demand that promise be fulfilled. If so, Jon would do it, though the thought weighed heavily on him. He'd never yearned for a political marriage, but he'd also do anything to ensure House Stark's survival. As they pressed deeper into the borderlands, outriders returned with mixed news. Small Lannister patrols had been spotted, but no sign of Tywin's main force. Some villages had surrendered at once, flying white flags upon seeing the wolf banner, remembering how the young wolf had treated captives fairly. Others were deserted, the inhabitants fled. Rumors flew that Tywin was massing an army near Ashmark, or perhaps near Castamir's ruins, or even at the crag. No one knew for certain. One evening, with the setting sun painting the sky in purples and oranges, the war horn sounded in the distance, an alarm from the outriders. Jon, seated near a small cookfire, leapt to his feet. Grey wind howled, and men scrambled for their weapons. Robb dashed out of his tent, sword half drawn. A rider pounded into camp, shouting hoarsely, "Enemies to the west, Sellswords or Lannister men, we can't be sure. They're mounted, maybe 300 strong. They ambushed our scouts near a ridge and are headed this way." Robb's eyes narrowed, adrenaline humming through the camp. "Form lines," he ordered the great Jon. "Archers on that rise there. Jon, take 50 men and circle around. We'll pin them between us." Jon nodded sharply, calling for a swift detachment. He mounted his horse, Ghost racing alongside. The men chosen were a mix of Stark guards and Riverland knights who knew how to ride at a gallop. They splashed across a shallow stream, following a narrow track that curved behind a low ridge. The ground was uneven, dotted with boulders and twisted shrubs. As they crested the ridge, they spied the enemy. A ragged company of riders armed with mismatched gear, some bearing the Golden Lion sigil but many flying no sigil at all. They galloped toward Robb's main host, but the dust cloud behind them suggested they were prepared for a rapid skirmish, not a full battle. Possibly, they meant to test the Stark lines or cause confusion before vanishing into the night. Jon urged his men into position, quietly signaled for them to hold until the enemy was parallel. Heart hammering, he peered between two boulders. He could see Robb's forces forming a disciplined line across the open terrain below, pikes and spears bristling. The Sellswords, if that's what they were, slowed, evidently reconsidering an all-out charge. Then gray wind burst from Robb's ranks, snarling, and the Sellsword horses spooked. Shouts rose. The Sellswords tried to wheel around, but that was Jon's cue. He shouted, "For the north!" and led his men down the slope at full gallop, flanking the foe. Chaos erupted. The Sellswords realized too late they were trapped. Arrows whistled from the Stark archers, dropping riders from their saddles. Jon swept in from the flank, Longclaw slicing through an enemy rider's side. Ghost leapt onto a second man's horse, ripping him down. Hoofs pounded, Men screamed. Swords clashed. A stark wind whipped dust across the battlefield. In moments, the Sellsword line collapsed. Many turned their mounts and fled, scattering into the rocky terrain. Some fought desperately, but the Northerners had the advantage of discipline and numbers. Robb signaled a charge, hitting them from the front. Trapped, about half the enemy surrendered, throwing down their weapons. A few were cut down as they tried to flee. When the dust settled, Jon sat astride his horse, breath coming quick, surveying the aftermath. Bodies lay strewn in the scrubby grass, the stench of blood drifting on the evening breeze. Men groaned or sobbed for mercy. Robb trotted over, gray wind at his heel, dismounting to check on his wounded men. Ser Ryman Frey approached, panting. They collapsed faster than I expected. Looked like an ill-led company. We took some alive. Should we question them? Robb nodded. Aye. Let's see who they serve. Tie them up, treat their wounded if you can. I'd rather have answers than corpses. The great Jon, helmet tucked under one arm, laughed coarsely. They're no knights, that's certain. More like scum who'd fight for whoever pays best. Let's find out whose coin they're taking. Jon dismounted and joined the men securing prisoners. He found a man wearing half-plate with a battered lion crest. The captive's face was a mask of fear, his arm gashed. Who commands you? Jon demanded. The man winced, struggling to stay on his feet. We're sworn to the Golden Company, he wheezed. But not the whole of them, just a smaller band. We had orders, from Lannister men to raid your scouts. Jon's brow furrowed. The Golden Company was the most famed Sellsword company in Essos, known for rarely breaking a contract. If they'd brought even a fraction of their forces to the Westerlands, that was dangerous news indeed. Where is Tywin Lannister? He pressed. I don't know, the man stammered. I swear it. Some say he's at the crag, others say he's at Casterly Rock. We get our orders from an envoy, all hush-hush. We're just told to hamper your movements. Jon nodded curtly. We'll see about that. Get him a maester if we can, so he doesn't die on us yet. Nearby, Robb was questioning another prisoner with Rickard Karstark. Similar answers emerged. A portion of the Golden Company had been hired to serve as Tywin's outriders, saboteurs, and raiders. They were meant to slow the northern advance until Tywin could muster enough forces for a major battle. Robb's face darkened when he heard. It seems Tywin won't fight fair, and why should we expect him to? The Golden Company is formidable. If he has them in large numbers, the tide could shift. We need to keep pressing forward, denying them time to gather. Night had fully fallen by the time they finished sorting the dead, treating the wounded, and posting guards. The Northmen made camp near a shallow stream, wary of further raids. Jon felt exhaustion weigh on his limbs as he sank onto a stool by the main tent. He removed his gauntlets and helmet, letting the cool night air touch his sweaty brow. Ghost settled at his feet. He thought of the distant north, of Winterfell's quiet courtyards, the swirling snows and howling winds. How he longed for the simple days, though they had never truly been simple, with him branded a bastard uncertain of his place. But at least he'd known the shape of his world, known his father's quiet strength. Now he was a commander, an oathbreaker, and half the realm seemed to ride on the edges of their swords. Robb found him eventually, wordlessly taking a seat on a makeshift bench. For a moment, neither spoke, the hush broken only by the murmurs of men bedded down for the night. Sometimes I wonder, Robb said at last, if we would have been better off not coming south at all. If Father had returned from King's Landing alive, we might have had peace in the north, safe from this madness. Jon breathed out, recalling Ned Stark's stern yet warm gaze. If Father had lived, perhaps. But the Lannisters would still be in power, and they would come for us sooner or later, out of fear or greed. At least now we've brought the fight to them on our own terms. Robb nodded, though sorrow lingered in his eyes. You're right. The die was cast when Father was killed. We had no choice but to answer. At least we're still standing, with our men intact, and the Freys quiet, for now. A bitter laugh escaped Jon's lips. Yes, thanks to all these marriages and treaties, there was no red wedding. But Walder Frey will want more if we win. More land, more titles, more everything. Robb gave a wry smile. He might even demand your hand in marriage to one of his granddaughters. That's what we agreed upon, if needed, Jon said softly. But let's not worry about that now. We have a war to finish. They sat in companionable silence until the watch's horn sounded once. An all's well signal. Robb rose, dusting off his cloak. Rest if you can, Jon. Tomorrow we press on. The road ahead grows more dangerous, but with each mile we're closer to seeing Tywin undone. And once we do, maybe we can finally go home. Jon ruffled Ghost's fur and nodded. Aye, home. The next weeks played out in a tense cat-and-mouse game across the Westerland's borders. The Golden Tooth fell to Robb's forces quickly, the small Lannister garrison surrendering after a token resistance. From there, the northern host advanced deeper into Lion territory. Hills studded with hidden hamlets or wealthy mines sprawled in all directions. Lannister outriders tested Robb's flanks, rarely offering a pitched battle but harassing supply wagons when they could. Scouts reported more sellswords in the area, though the bulk of Tywin's army remained elusive. The Great Jon grew restless. Damn that old lion, he grumbled. Too craven to face us in the open. We should strike deeper, burn his estates, force him to come out. Rickard Karstark agreed with grim satisfaction. Let him see how it feels to have his lands pillaged, his small folk frightened. The Lannisters did worse to ours. Robb, though not above such tactics, chose a methodical approach. He sent raiding parties to disrupt roads and gold mines, but he forbade the worst atrocities. Word spread among the local population that the young wolf was fierce but fair, punishing no one who did not raise arms against him. Some hamlets opened their doors to northern riders, offering meager gifts of bread or revealing caches of Lannister supplies. Others fled, terrified, until they realized the northern code of conduct was not one of blind pillage. Slowly, the noose tightened. Robb's outriders scoured the countryside, capturing or scattering small bands of Lannister loyalists. Bolton's men, coldly efficient, set watch on key roads. Jon led a detachment to a vantage point in the hills, scanning for dust clouds that might betray a large host on the move. Days slipped into weeks. One evening, as the sun set behind jagged peaks to the west, a scout galloped into camp with urgent news. A large force bearing Lannister banners had been sighted near the ruins of Castamere, heading north. Their numbers were uncertain, but they carried proud sigils of the Golden Lion. Tywin might be with them, or perhaps he had entrusted the lead to one of his generals, Ser Kevan Lannister, or the Mountain that rides. No one knew yet. Robb summoned all lords to council in a field tent. If they're heading north, they might try to slip around us and into the Riverlands, or even try to link with some other force. We can't let that happen. We'll move to intercept. If we can force them into a pitched battle on ground of our choosing, so much the better. Scouts were dispatched in haste to track the Lannister column's movements through the night. The northern army packed up camp with disciplined speed, marching soon after dawn. The men were weary but determined. They sensed that a confrontation loomed, one that might end this war if they played it right. After 2 days of hard riding, the outriders returned with fresh intelligence. The Lannister force had halted near a broad plain dotted with scattered groves and rocky outcrops. They seemed to be fortifying a position around an old keep known as Pendrick Hills, a minor seat once loyal to House Lannister. Robb studied the map with Jon, Bolton, Karstark, and the Great Jon. If we attack them there, we risk fighting on ground they've chosen. But if we wait too long, they might slip away again. Our best chance to stop them is here and now. Bolton's voice was measured. We might approach from 2 sides. Karstark can flank from the north, the Great Jon from the east, and you, Your Grace, from the south. I'll remain in reserve with a portion of our infantry and cavalry, ready to exploit any weakness. Jon traced a line on the map. I can lead a detachment here along this ridge. The vantage might let us rain arrows on their position, but we'd have to be quick. They'll see us coming. Robb made his decision. At dawn, they would strike. The The men readied themselves that night, checking weapons, calming nervous horses. Campfires flickered under the starry sky, and the tension was so palpable one could almost taste it. Jon spent hours with Robb, reviewing final details. When the horns sounded at first light, they parted to their respective commands, clasping forearms in a show of faith. Jon rode ahead with a contingent of archers and light horse, forging a path around the ridgeline. The plan was to secure the high ground, from which they could harry the Lannister lines. He felt the cold sting of morning air on his cheeks, saw Ghost bounding easily over rocks. Heart pounding, he remembered the countless battles they'd survived. Whispering Wood, the taking of Harrenhal, the siege of King's Landing. This might be the final test. As the sun's first rays broke over the horizon, he spied the Lannister camp below. It was no small force. Rows of tents and men stretched across the plain. A single lion banner flapped in the breeze near the center. Jon's stomach twisted. It could be Tywin's personal standard. He signaled his archers into position behind a rocky crest, waiting for Robb's main assault to begin. Minutes crept by, the silence of dawn broken only by the shuffle of horses and the rasp of breath. Then, far to the south, a horn blast rang out, Robb's signal. The Greyjohn's war drums thundered from the east, echoing off the hills. From his vantage, Jon watched the Lannister camp erupt in frantic activity. Men rushing to don armor and form ranks. Now was the time. Jon ordered his archers to loose volleys into the swirling chaos below. Arrows arced through the pale sky, raining down among the half-formed Lannister lines. Shouts and screams rang out. A knight's horse went down, flailing. Another arrow struck a banner-bearer, toppling him. Confusion spread through the Lannister ranks. Then Robb's cavalry thundered in from the south, gray wind at the fore. The clash of steel and the roar of men merged into a single terrifying cacophony. To the north, Karstark's men descended with savage fury, seeking vengeance for lost kin. The Great Jon advanced from the east, bellowing war cries. The Lannisters, pinned on three sides, had little room to maneuver, yet they fought fiercely, determined not to break. Jon led a charge from the ridge. His horse picked its way down a steep path, hooves sliding on loose gravel. Ghost sprinted ahead, white fur gleaming in the morning light. They slammed into the Lannister flank, swords flashing. Jon guided Longclaw with calm precision, cutting down a mailed spearman who turned too slow. Another lunged at him. Jon parried, then drove the pommel into the man's helm, unhorsing him. Screams and the reek of blood filled the air. Banners twisted and fell. The press of bodies was intense, and at times, Jon barely recognized friend from foe. He glimpsed Rickard Karstark carving a path through Lannister infantry, spurred on by personal hatred. The Greyjohn's booming laughter echoed as he swung a massive axe, scattering men like straw. Across the plain, Robb's standard still flew, the direwolf snapping in the wind. Surrounded by a wedge of loyal knights, Robb pushed toward the heart of the Lannister formation. If Tywin was there, he would find him soon. Jon pressed forward, cutting down another man who tried to hamstring his horse. Ghost snarled at a crossbowman, forcing him to drop his weapon. At some point, a horn sounded from the Lannister side, an attempt to rally or perhaps to organize a retreat. Jon's archers kept loosing arrows from the ridge, whittling down the enemy's rear. The confusion in the Lannister ranks deepened. Men began to break away, some tossing their arms aside in surrender. Others tried to flee westward, only to be met by Bolton's reserve force circling in. Jon dismounted to fight on foot when the throng of bodies grew too dense for mounted combat. Ghost stayed near, snapping at Lannister ankles. Breath ragged, Jon found himself face to face with a tall knight in gilded armor who roared the name Lannister as he lunged. Jon sidestepped, crossing swords, sparks flying. The knight was skilled, forcing Jon to pivot and block repeatedly. The clash rang in his ears, jarring his arm to the shoulder. Then Ghost streaked in, lunging at the knight's calf. Distracted, the knight hesitated, and Jon's blade thrust up into the gap of his visor. The knight fell with a gurgling cry. All around him, men died or yielded. The battlefield was thick with wounded, and the golden lion banners drooped in the dust. Suddenly, a hush spread. The fighting ebbed, and Jon saw men lowering arms, stumbling back. Robb stood in the center of it all, splattered with gore, gray wind panting at his side. Facing him, pinned by 2 Stark knights, was an older man in battered plate bearing the lion sigil. A man with graying hair and a cold, imperious face. Tywin Lannister. He had lost his helm, revealing a gash along his temple, but his green eyes still burned with defiance. A wave of awe rippled through the northern ranks. They had captured Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, the man who had orchestrated so much of their suffering. Karstark shoved forward, eyes blazing. "Let me kill him," he spat. "For my sons, for your father." Robb, chest heaving, stared at Tywin. "Your men are defeated, Lord Lannister. Yield." Tywin's lip curled in scorn. "And if I don't?" Robb's voice was hoarse but firm. "Then you die here, and your house crumbles without you. Don't think I won't do it." Tywin glared, but he saw the circle of steel around him. He was cornered, outnumbered. With a trembling breath, he let his sword drop to the blood-soaked ground. "I yield," he said bitterly. A ragged cheer erupted from the northern host. Karstark looked as though he might disobey and drive his blade into Tywin's throat anyway, but Robb commanded him to stand down. Meanwhile, the great Jon roared in triumph, brandishing his axe. Jon made his way through the throng, chest tightening as he realized what they had accomplished. Tywin Lannister was theirs, alive. This war might truly be over. He knelt briefly by the body of a fallen Stark bannerman, then rose, meeting Robb's eyes across the churned battlefield. The king in the north gave Jon a nod that was half relief, half sorrow for those who had fallen to make this moment possible. They had done it without a red wedding, without House Stark betrayed. They had met the Lannisters in open battle and prevailed. The day was theirs, though the cost in blood was steep. The last lion in the lion's den was now a prisoner, and the path to peace, to Winterfell, stood open at last. In the days to come, they would have to decide Tywin's fate, negotiate with the Golden Company, if any remained, and face the reality of a fractured realm under Stannis. But for now, on this field littered with the trophies of war and the bodies of the fallen, a chapter of vengeance had finally found its end. The next morning dawned cool and gray, a soft mist draping the battlefield. Carrion birds hovered, waiting to feast once the living had left. Robb's camp stirred early, men rising with stiff limbs and aching wounds, forging what breakfast they could from dwindling supplies. Despite weariness, there was a palpable sense of victory. Tents rustled with subdued jubilation, quiet talk of going home soon, of forging a lasting peace. Jon woke in a small tent he shared with a handful of Stark guards. Ghost was curled at his feet, muzzle red-stained from the previous day's fighting. Carefully, Jon rose and stretched, biting back a wince from bruised ribs. Outside, the world smelled of damp earth and death. He made his way to Robb's command tent, where the king in the north stood with gray wind near the opening. Lady Catelyn was there, having arrived by Raven's request, and by her own insistence, shortly after news of the impending battle reached King's Landing. She had traveled day and night. Now she stood by her son, face pale but resolute. Tywin Lannister was bound under heavy guard nearby, with lines of northern soldiers watching his every move. Within the tent, a makeshift war council was assembled. Roose Bolton, Rickard Karstark, the Blackfish, the Great Jon, and several other lords formed a half-circle around Robb. Tywin was brought in, hands manacled. A hush settled. Robb met Tywin's eyes. "You have cost us thousands of good men. You conspired to kill my father, to raise a false king on the Iron Throne. The North will have justice." Tywin's voice was cold. "Speak your terms, boy. Or do you intend to behead me like your father once beheaded the deserters of the Night's Watch?" His glare flicked briefly to Jon, then back to Robb. Jon bristled but held his peace. Robb clenched his jaw. "We are not butchers, despite what you may think. The war is all but over. You will sign a formal surrender, acknowledging the independence of the North and the Riverlands, and you will swear that House Lannister will raise no arms against us again. In return, I will allow you to live. Your children, though still free, will remain at Casterly Rock, subject to certain conditions. If you refuse, or if you break these terms once they're set, your life is forfeit." A grim murmur passed among the gathered lords. Karstark's face was dark with dissatisfaction. He clearly wanted Tywin's blood. Roose Bolton's eyes were unreadable. Lady Catelyn watched with carefully controlled calm, though her fingers trembled. Tywin straightened his back, despite the manacles. "You ask me to consign House Lannister to a lesser status, at the mercy of the wolves? And all for the promise of my miserable life." Robb's expression hardened. "Your house is already consigned to a lesser status by your own hand. You've lost. This is mercy, Lord Tywin. More than you would have shown us had the positions been reversed." Tywin seemed to weigh his chances, glancing about the tent. The ring of steel around him was absolute. No cunning escape or bribe would succeed here. He exhaled through his nose. "Very well. I submit for now." Rickard Karstark made a strangled sound of protest. "This man killed my sons. He's the reason they rotted in Harrenhal. Let me execute him and be done." Robb raised a hand. "I understand your grief, Lord Karstark, but this is the best path for the North's future. Killing Tywin now might satisfy our rage, but it could prolong the war if other Lannisters or Sellsword companies vow revenge. If he surrenders fully, we can end the conflict." Karstark's mouth twisted in anger, but he said nothing further. Tywin watched it all with cold disdain, though he was not fool enough to test the king in the North's patience. Lady Catelyn stepped forward. Her voice was low. "A formal treaty must be drafted and signed before witnesses. Let us also consider hostages to ensure compliance. Some younger Lannisters, perhaps." Tywin's face twitched, but he gave a stiff nod. "If that is your price, so be it." The War Council dissolved into the complicated details of negotiation. The number of hostages, the exact wording of the surrender, the shipping of gold from Lannister mines to pay reparations, and the distribution of certain lands in the Riverlands that had once belonged to houses destroyed by Lannister forces. It was tedious, but it carried the promise of peace. Jon watched quietly, remembering the moment he had stood on the ramparts of Winterfell so long ago, still wearing the black cloak of the Night's Watch. All that had happened since then. His father's death, his desertion, the battles, the forging of alliances, led to this. The realm might finally see an end to the fighting, and the North would be free. He felt a surge of relief and a strange hollowness, as though he had been running on adrenaline for so long he'd forgotten any other state. Late in the day, with parchments drawn up and Tywin Lannister placed under guard in a secure tent, Robb called his bannermen together once more. "We've done it," he declared, voice hoarse from hours of debate. "The Lannisters are defeated. House Stark's vengeance is sated, our father avenged. We will finalize the terms over the coming days, and we will ensure the realm knows that the king in the North stands victorious. You have all served bravely. I thank you for your valor and loyalty." A wave of cheers and thumps on shields filled the dusty air. Men embraced. Some wept for fallen comrades who would never see this victory. The great Jon hoisted a wineskin and roared, "To the king in the North," which set off another crescendo of exultation. Jon, standing near the edge of the crowd, felt a tug on his sleeve. He turned to see Lady Catelyn. Her eyes shimmered with tears. She pulled him into a brief embrace. "You were your father's son throughout all of this," she whispered, "and I am grateful you chose to stand with us instead of staying at the wall." Jon's throat tightened. He had never quite known where he stood with Lady Catelyn. His very existence was a thorn in her marriage to Ned, a living proof of her husband's supposed infidelity. Yet in this moment, she seemed to embrace him as family. He bowed his head. "Thank you, my lady." She released him, wiping her eyes. "Come. Robb will need us by his side as we move forward. The realm is not at peace yet, and neither is the North." Jon nodded, remembering the growing whispers of dark things beyond the wall. He had left the watch, but the threat of the White Walkers might still loom. A fleeting image of that old ranger, frozen in terror, flickered in Jon's mind. One day that threat might overshadow all these petty wars. But for the moment, the realm's swords were turned inward, not northward. They spent the next week in the Westerlands, finalizing the treaty and ensuring the Lannister forces truly disbanded. Tywin chafed under captivity, but he had no choice except to comply. A half-dozen of his kin, cousins, nephews were to be sent east as hostages. The gold mines would pay war reparations to the north and the Riverlands. Meanwhile, ravens flew out announcing the Lannister defeat and the official recognition of northern independence. Stannis would have to acknowledge it publicly, but word was that he planned to do so. Robb considered a grand victory march to King's Landing, but decided instead to see to the north. The men yearned for home. The kingdom needed its king to return, to rebuild Winterfell and restore order after the Ironborn occupation. There were still pockets of Ironborn reavers scattered in the coastal areas, though Balon Greyjoy had gone silent again. And so, on a crisp morning, the northern host began its return journey. They parted ways with some of the Riverlanders, who stayed to protect their own lands, and left a small garrison behind to keep watch on Tywin's compliance. The Stark banners led the march eastward, then northward, crossing once again into the Riverlands, then onward toward the Neck. Along the way, villages that had once been ravaged by war greeted them with cautious optimism, offering bread and salted fish. Children ran beside the troops, gaping at the direwolves. At Moat Cailin, the ancient stronghold that guarded the passage into the north, Robb was greeted with a thunderous salute by the men who had garrisoned it. Finally, the path opened onto the familiar forests and the rolling plains leading up to Winterfell's region. The air turned sharper with each mile, the sky a paler shade of blue. Winterfell itself emerged on the horizon one late afternoon. Smoke rose from chimneys, the repairs to the walls and towers clearly underway after the damage done by the Ironborn. Banner men waiting on the ramparts cheered, sounding horns at the sight of the returning king. When Robb and Jon rode through the gates, they were met by grateful faces. Men, women, and children who had survived the occupation, who had rebuilt and waited for the day the Starks would truly come home. Emotion seized Jon as he guided his horse into the courtyard where he had grown up. Memories of scrubbing stables, sparring with Robb, sharing half-friendly scowls with Sansa or Arya flitted through his mind. Now he returned as a warrior, a commander, and a survivor of countless battles. Ghost paused to sniff the familiar air, as though recognizing the sense of home. Robb dismounted, and the crowd parted in a hush. "My people," he said, voice carrying across the courtyard, "we have returned. The war may not be done everywhere in the realm, but in the north we are free. Let it be known that we stand as an independent kingdom once more, never to bow to a southern throne." A roar of approval went up, echoing off the ancient stone. Those who remembered Ned Stark felt that old sense of Stark guardianship wash over the keep. Joy and relief mingled in the crisp wind. The days that followed were filled with settling affairs at Winterfell. Maester Luwin, older now and worn by the siege, greeted them with tears of joy in his eyes, though he lamented the high cost of the war. Repairs to the library tower and the walls progressed. The great hall once more bustled with feasts, humble ones at first, as supplies were still not abundant, but filled with laughter and song. Lords from across the north arrived, paying homage to Robb, congratulating him on his victory. Jon found a sense of purpose in helping rebuild. He took charge of a team of carpenters one day, forging new timbers for a collapsed rampart. He oversaw the training yard, where new recruits were drilled for the city watch and for the broader northern defense. He rode out with small parties to the outlying villages, ensuring they had enough seeds for the next planting season. Everywhere he went, he was met with gratitude and a measure of curiosity. Eddard Stark's bastard, who had helped lead the North to victory and had forsaken his vows at the Wall. Sometimes he thought of that vow with a pang. The White Walkers, the Wall's defenses. He knew that threat was real. The realm might be content with these southern victories, but winter still approached. Should he try to warn Robb anew, push him to send men to the wall? But without tangible proof, who would believe him? With the Night's Watch weakened, it would be up to House Stark to prepare if the threat came. As the weeks passed, the realm learned of Tywin's surrender, of Stannis' uneasy seat upon the Iron Throne, of the official recognition of the kingdom in the north. Tales spread of how Jon Snow had fought at Robb's side at Harrenhal and King's Landing. Ballads whispered that no Red Wedding had marred the Stark campaign because of cunning diplomacy and unwavering loyalty between the Stark brothers. And yet, for all the victory, new challenges surfaced. Walder Frey's demands for further compensation arrived by Raven, couched in insufferably polite language. The Iron Islands remained a question mark. Balon Greyjoy might still plot further incursions. Rumors hinted that Peter Baelish was stirring trouble in the Vale. Across the Narrow Sea, Daenerys Targaryen reportedly gathered an army. And always, in the darkest corners of the north, old stories of the others refused to stay silent. One morning, Robb summoned Jon to the Godswood. Snow dusted the branches of the ancient weirwood, whose face gazed silently upon the reflecting pool. The air was chill, but the sunlight made the drifting flakes sparkle. Robb stood in his fur cloak, leaning on his sword, gray wind resting at his feet. Jon approached with Ghost, feeling the hush of the sacred space. They had come here often as boys, though back then, the world had seemed simpler. Robb turned. "You came." Jon nodded. "You sent for me." A moment of silence. Then Robb said, "Winter is on its way, truly. The days are shorter. The nights are colder. The small folk say they can feel it in their bones. You've warned me before that something stirs beyond the wall. We no longer have men to spare for the watch, but maybe we can do something. We're the Starks. It's our duty to guard the north." Jon exhaled, a plume of warm breath in the frosty air. "We can at least send supplies, skilled builders, maybe a few hundred soldiers to reinforce the castles on the wall. We might not be able to man all of them, but Eastwatch, Castle Black, and the Shadow Tower are crucial. If anything emerges, they'll need every advantage." Robb nodded, eyes on the weirwood's carved face. "We'll do it. Stannis has his throne to guard. Tywin is pacified. The Freys can complain, but the survival of the North stands above all. This is Father's legacy, our legacy. We can't ignore it." Jon felt relief coursing through him. "Thank you." Robb turned to face Jon fully, the hush broken only by the gentle wind in the branches overhead. "There's another matter. You've done so much for the North, for me. The men speak of you as a Stark, not a Snow, and I'm king in the North. I have the power to legitimize you, Jon, if you'll accept it." Jon's heart thudded. This was not the first time the idea had arisen, but to hear it stated so plainly in the gods would shook him. Robb's gaze was steady. "You're my brother. You've more than earned the name. If we want the North strong and united, we must put old divisions behind us. The memory of our father deserves that. Let me do this." Jon hesitated. A swirl of emotions knotted in his chest. Gratitude, longing, doubt. He had spent his whole life as the bastard of Winterfell, uncertain of his place. To suddenly become Jon Stark, it would change everything. But it might also bind him more tightly to the realm of men, to the North, especially if the threat from beyond the wall proved real. He thought of the promises he'd made, to keep the North safe, to stand by Robb's side. He remembered Ygritte, the wildling girl he had never actually met in this new timeline. But the echoes of a possible life haunted him. Paths diverged. He was no longer a brother of the Watch, but a brother of House Stark. At last, he nodded slowly. "Yes, I'll accept. If you believe it's right, then so do I." A rare smile touched Robb's lips. "We'll have a ceremony. Not a grand affair, but enough that all the lords see you as my brother in name as well as blood. You will be Jon Stark, and you shall have all the rights of a trueborn son of Ned Stark." Jon swallowed hard. "Thank you, Robb." They stood there in companionable silence for a time, letting the moment sink in. Ghost paced around the reflecting pool, nose twitching at the scents in the cold air. Gray Wind watched calmly, ears flicking at the distant caw of a raven. Eventually, Robb spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I suppose you know what that might mean with respect to Walder Frey's demands. He might push for that old arrangement, marriage to one of his brood. Now that you're a trueborn Stark, the match becomes even more valuable to him. Are you ready for that?" Jon sighed. "I'll do my duty if we must. Perhaps we can find a different route. But if we have no choice, I'll honor the vow. The realm needs peace." Robb gave a resigned nod. "We have time. For now, let's celebrate what we've achieved. Father would be proud. Soon, the lords will gather in the Great Hall, and I'll proclaim you Jon Stark. The new Lord of, well, we'll figure out the details. But you'll be more than a swordsman at my side." Jon placed a hand on Robb's shoulder. "Thank you, brother." They left the Godswood together, returning to the bustle of Winterfell's courtyards where carpenters hammered, blacksmiths forged new blades, and the old castle slowly reclaimed its dignity. The war was not wholly finished. Conflicts simmered in the south, and the Ironborn might still raid the coasts. The Vale and Dorne had yet to firmly declare for Stannis or themselves, and the political wrangling of King's Landing might never truly cease. But the North, at least, was free and united. The horrors of a Red Wedding had been averted by Jon's presence and Robb's more careful decisions. House Stark endured, with two of Ned Stark's sons forging a new destiny for the kingdom in the north of the world. And though the whispers of winter's dark terrors still troubled Jon's dreams, he knew that as Jon Stark, acknowledged son of Eddard, brother to the king, he would have a chance to protect all he loved from whatever shadows crept beyond the wall. For now, Winterfell's walls rang with the music of hammers and the laughter of reunited families, a place of hope built upon the ashes of war. And in the hearts of the northern people, they whispered that the wolves had come home at last. When the day of Jon's legitimization arrived, Winterfell stirred with an air of quiet excitement that harkened back to gentler times, before war had consumed so many lives and fortunes. Dawn broke cold and crisp, with a fine dusting of snow powdering the rooftops and walls under a pale sky. Servants scurried through the courtyards, carrying trays of hot mulled wine for the lords newly arrived to witness the ceremony. A handful of traveling musicians, braving the northern roads for a chance to play at the Stark's seat in this extraordinary moment, set up near the main keep, tentatively tuning their viols and lutes. Though the war was largely behind them, scars lingered on the ramparts where ironborn axes and fires had left their mark, and the main gate still showed patches of raw, new lumber where repairs were underway. Yet the courtyard bustled with a sense of renewal. Men and women in heavy cloaks exchanged subdued smiles. Some dusted off their best attire. A handful of local villagers and craftsmen had come within the walls to share in the festivities, telling each other that such a celebration was a sign the North was truly regaining its identity, separate and at peace. Jon Snow, soon to be Jon Stark, rose early from the small room he had chosen, one not far from the Great Keep. He had politely declined the grander quarters offered by Robb, preferring a more modest space for the time being. Over the last few nights, sleep had come fitfully. His mind was a tumble of memories. Childhood moments in the yard with Robb, King's Landing in flames, Harrenhal under siege, the bitter wind of the wall's heights. He would lie awake listening to Ghost's soft breathing and watch the faint moonlight shift across the floorboards. He scarcely knew how to feel about the changes about to unfold. To bear the Stark name, truly and legally, he had dreamed of it as a boy only to dismiss it as an impossible fancy. Today, that dream would take shape under the eyes of the Northern Lords, with Robb's blessing as king in the North. Jon felt a flicker of anxiety mixed with gratitude. Part of him still questioned whether he deserved it, or whether Eddard Stark had truly intended a different fate for him. But the realm had changed, and so had he. He washed quickly, the basin's water almost icy to the touch. His breath came in misty puffs. As he drew on a fresh tunic dyed in stark gray, he realized it was the finest garment he'd worn since leaving the wall, embroidered along the cuffs and collar with swirling wolf sigils. He donned a fur-trimmed cloak that had been left for him by the castle tailors, tested the fit, then strapped Longclaw to his hip. The sword that bore the snarling wolf's head pommel was a symbol of his father's memory, and of all the battles he had fought as Jon Snow. Now it would become the sword of Jon Stark, if the gods and the king in the north willed it. When he stepped into the hallway, Ghost padded faithfully at his side. The direwolf's presence had become a familiar comfort to the people of Winterfell. They had grown used to the sight of both Ghost and Grey Wind prowling the courtyards. Though Ghost's red eyes unsettled some, his calm, near-silent gait reminded them that the pack had returned, and the north, after so many trials, was beginning to heal. Jon descended to the Great Hall, where a small gathering of onlookers had already formed near the dais. It was still early, but they wanted good vantage. He noticed a handful of lords conversing in low voices, among them Lord Serwyn, Lady Barbary Dustin, and Lord Wyman Manderley. They each greeted Jon with polite warmth, calling him Snow for perhaps the last time. At the far side, a cluster of men with twin tower badges stood stiffly. Representatives of House Frey, no doubt. Ser Ryman Frey offered Jon a curt nod. "A fine morning for a ceremony," he said in a tone that tried and failed to sound congratulatory. Jon inclined his head. A fine morning indeed. He sensed the tension. The Freys had come north on the matter of overdue rewards and the possibility of that marriage pact. Walder Frey had not forgotten Jon's promise to marry a Frey if required. But for now, in the aftermath of the war, those demands remained in negotiation. Walder Frey's letter to Robb had been laced with honeyed words and veiled threats. More lands, more titles, more advantageous betrothals. Jon felt the pressure weigh on him, but he set it aside. Today was about his adoption into House Stark. Marriage talk could wait. Outside, the watchers on the battlements sounded a horn call, letting the castle know that King Robb Stark and his retinue approached from the Godswood. Robb had spent the early morning praying and reflecting at the Heart Tree, as was becoming his custom after the horrors of war. Soon, the great oak doors of the hall swung open, and Robb entered. He wore a sable cloak pinned with the direwolf clasp, a simple circlet of bronze and iron resting on his auburn curls. His crown as king in the north. Grey Wind padded at his side with regal poise. Behind him, Lady Catelyn walked, shoulders squared, her eyes gleaming with restrained pride. Maester Luwin hovered near, shuffling a parchment that held the formal words of legitimization. Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, followed last, his posture erect, gaze sober but kind. As Robb walked toward the dais, the assembled lords bowed, and the few ladies in attendance curtsied. Robb's face flicked with embarrassment at such displays. He might be their king, but he was still young, still unaccustomed to the formalities. He mounted the dais with a decisive step, turned, and with a clear voice addressed the hall. "My friends, my lords and ladies of the north," Robb began, the words carrying a quiet authority. "We gather this day to affirm what many of us have come to see as truth for some time now, that my brother Jon Snow is a Stark in all but name. Through his loyalty in battle, his counsel in times of crisis, and his sacrifice on behalf of our house, Jon has proved his worthiness to bear the direwolf sigil. As king in the north, it is my will to remove the stigma of bastardy from him. Let him stand forward." Jon felt the prickle of many eyes upon him. He stepped toward the dais, halting a few paces before Robb. The great hall was silent save for the soft scrape of boots on stone. Lady Catelyn watched with parted lips, and something like a watery smile began to form on her face, though he sensed old conflicts still lingered in her heart. Maester Luwin unrolled the parchment, clearing his throat. "By the laws of the north, and the ancient custom that grants the king in the north authority over his vassals and family, we, the undersigned, affirm and witness that Jon, known heretofore as Jon Snow, of the blood of Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, is hereby granted full rights and honors as a trueborn son of House Stark. He shall henceforth be known as Jon Stark, rightful member of the bloodline of House Stark, and a bannerman to his brother Robb Stark, king in the north." A hush fell. Robb extended one hand. "Kneel, brother." Jon eased Longclaw from his belt, handing it to Robb. Then he knelt on one knee, trying to keep his posture steady. His heart thudded. Ghost stood behind him, ears pricked, tail still. Robb lightly set the flat of Longclaw's Valyrian blade against Jon's shoulder. Jon, by the power vested in me as king in the north, I remove the name Snow from you and bestow upon you the name Stark. Rise, my brother. Rise as Jon Stark, son of Eddard Stark, rightful of Winterfell and the north." Jon stood, and a moment later, Robb pressed the sword's hilt into his hands once more. A cheer rose in the hall. It was not a thunderous roar. Winterfell had seen too much war for that. But it was a resonant, heartfelt acclamation. The lords and ladies who had come from near and far echoed the cry, "Jon Stark! Jon Stark!" Jon's gaze darted over the crowd, seeing the approving nods of lords like Lord Wyman Manderly, the cautious acceptance of some of the more skeptical northern clans, the glint of curiosity and frustration in the Frey's eyes. Brynden Tully offered a small but encouraging smile. Lady Catelyn dipped her head, the corners of her mouth trembling. In that moment, Jon realized he truly stood as her stepson in name as well as in fact. Whatever their past tensions, perhaps time would soothe them. Robb clasped Jon's forearm, pulling him into a brief embrace. "Brother," he murmured, voice choked with emotion. "I'm proud to have you at my side, always." Jon managed a tight smile. "I thank you, Your Grace." Then, quietly, "I thank you, Robb." The sense of finality in that moment was overwhelming. He was Jon Stark now, no longer a Snow, no longer bound by the half-acceptance he had lived with since boyhood. A swirl of gratitude, relief, and a hint of sorrow for all the lost years washed through him. If only their father could have witnessed this day. Eddard Stark would have solemnly nodded, likely, then embraced Jon with that quiet, fatherly warmth. But the father was gone. It fell to the sons to carry his legacy onward. At Robb's prompting, the hall erupted into a more festive atmosphere. Tables had been set up along the sides, bearing trays of bread, roasted vegetables, salted fish, and even some spiced mutton. Several casks of ale and mead were tapped, and cups were quickly filled. The traveling musicians struck up a lively tune on strings and flutes, weaving a melody that evoked the old songs of the north. Men clapped in time or stomped their boots. A few women attempted a simple step dance near the dais. Jon found himself thrust into the role of guest of honor, repeatedly toasted by men he'd never met. Lord Serwyn, ruddy-faced from an early taste of mead, clasped Jon's hand. "I fought with your father at the Trident, lad. He'd be proud as seven hells to see this day." Others echoed similar sentiments. Jon did his best to nod and smile, uncertain how to respond to such earnest praise. Lady Barbary Dustin, in a sumptuous black cloak lined with sable, approached with a faintly mocking tilt to her head. "Well, Jon Stark, your name rings far grander than that of a mere bastard. Will you be seeking a keep of your own, or remain in Winterfell at your brother's side?" "I will remain at Winterfell," Jon said simply. "We have much work yet to do, milady." She studied him with sharp eyes. "Yes, the war might be done, but rebuilding is a burdensome thing. I trust you'll not shirk your duties to the north." Jon forced a polite smile. "I won't. There's no shortage of responsibilities." Barbary Dustin gave a thin-lipped nod, as if satisfied by that. Then she drifted away, leaving Jon to wonder yet again how deep the North's old grudges ran. He recalled that Lady Dustin had once blamed Ned Stark for certain slights from long ago. Perhaps she would keep her peace now that the North was free. The phrase lingered in the periphery. Ser Ryman and two of his cousins, one of them a thin-lipped young woman, the other a stout older man, glanced frequently in Jon's direction. At length, Ser Ryman came forward to offer a flourish of a bow. "Lord Jon Stark, is it now? My sincerest congratulations." Jon inclined his head. "I appreciate your attendance, Ser Ryman." The man's voice held a hint of calculation. "My grandfather Walder Frey will be most pleased to learn that House Stark flourishes so vigorously. He cherishes alliances that benefit both parties, as I'm sure you know. Perhaps soon you and I can discuss." "Not now," came a firm voice from behind Ser Ryman. Lady Catelyn had stepped up, blue eyes cool. "This is a day for celebration and courtesy. We will not mar it with talk of negotiations." Ser Ryman swallowed, stepping back at the glare of Catelyn Stark. "Yes, my lady," he managed. Then he glanced at Jon once more. "We'll speak another time, my lord." He retreated, leaving behind a faint whiff of impatience and ambition. Jon let out a small breath. "Thank you, Lady Catelyn." She nodded, folding her hands. "Enjoy your day, Jon. I suspect the Freys will not let the matter rest for long. But for now, I'd not let them sour this." She paused, looking around the hall. "This is quite a day to see you named a Stark. I know you and I have not always seen eye to eye, but I hope we can move forward in harmony now." Jon's throat tightened at her words. He searched her face and saw genuine, if somewhat conflicted, sincerity. "I would like that, my lady," he said quietly. Catelyn pressed her lips together, then touched Jon's arm lightly. "Then let us try." She stepped away to greet another guest, leaving Jon with an odd sense of relief and uncertainty. The afternoon wore on with food, music, and cautious revelry. Robb withdrew briefly to attend to some pressing matter brought by Roose Bolton, news of a small Greyjoy reaving party near the Rills. Winter was coming, as always, and that meant new hazards by land and sea. Jon continued to mingle as best he could, though he was never one for large gatherings. He soon found solace on the edge of the dais, near a warm brazier, where the Blackfish joined him in quiet conversation. "You played a great role in this war," Brynden Tully said, arms folded. "I doubt my niece or nephew would have fared as well without you." "I was one sword among many," Jon replied. "But yes, I tried to help where I could." Brynden nodded. "Stark or Snow, you are a fighter. Now that you're legitimized, I imagine the realm will find new ways to rely upon you. Let's hope you're up to it." "I hope so too," Jon said. He thought of the wall, of the unspoken threat from beyond. So far, the others had not shown themselves, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they stirred in the far north. When evening fell, the air in the great hall grew stuffy from the press of bodies, the warmth of torches, and the rising swirl of conversation. Servants brought out fresh pitchers of ale and trays of hot pies. Robb reemerged from his discussion with Bolton, wearing the faint signs of worry that always accompanied news of unrest in the North's far reaches. But when the crowd pressed him for toasts and songs, he obliged, setting aside his concerns for a moment to honor Jon's day. Finally, the festivities began to wind down. Many of the visiting lords and ladies drifted away to their quarters, or else found their way into small groups finishing off flasks of mead. Jon, worn out, slipped out of the hall and into the courtyard. A pale moon glowed overhead, illuminating the towers and ramparts that so many had fought to reclaim. Ghost followed faithfully, silent as a shadow. Jon found a relatively quiet nook near the archery butts, where a small patch of snow glimmered in the moonlight. He exhaled, letting the cold air clear his head. Tomorrow, it would be back to the daily reality. Balancing the demands of the North, bracing for winter, keeping an eye on the Freys, and possibly negotiating with King Stannis if the realm's affairs required it. But for now, in this moment, he wanted to absorb the feeling of belonging. Footsteps crunched behind him. He glanced back, seeing Robb. The king in the north wore a heavy cloak, breath puffing in the frigid air. Gray wind lingered by the gate, watchful. "You vanished on your own," Robb said, coming to stand beside Jon. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." Jon smiled faintly. "Just needed some air." The hall was too crowded. Robb nodded, silent for a moment. His eyes wandered over the courtyard, the scaffolding where masons worked to repair the keep's outer wall. "Father would be proud to see you as a Stark. I wish he could have done it himself." Jon swallowed. "Me too. But you did it. And I'm grateful." They stood side by side, letting the hush of the winter night fill the silence. Then Robb asked, more quietly, "Have you given any more thought to the matter of the Freys?" Jon's jaw clenched. "Not tonight, but I know it's coming. Walder Frey will want a formal betrothal, perhaps more. He might press for me to marry one of his granddaughters. Or he might demand a different arrangement if he thinks it can wring more advantage out of us." Robb's lips twisted in distaste. "If we refuse, he might not openly rebel, but he could cause trouble. We need to keep him calm." The man's as slippery as an eel. But the North's unity is our priority, and the Riverlands are my mother's domain. Walder Frey's hold over the twins is too crucial for us to risk open hostility. We might have to give him something. Jon nodded grimly. We'll see what can be done. I'm no stranger to duty, Robb, but I'd rather not bind myself to someone under threat. Still, if it's needed. Robb placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. I would never force you into something that would make you truly miserable, but we have to consider the good of the realm. We have a council meeting in a few days to address various issues, including the Freys. Let's decide then. Jon managed a small smile. I appreciate it. Let's get through this winter first. Robb's smile in return was tinged with relief. Yes, one hurdle at a time. They parted ways, each heading toward his respective chamber. Jon made his way to the calm of his small room, Ghost at his heels, and sank onto his bed. His mind whirled with thoughts of Frey ambitions, Greyjoy raids, and the new name that he carried. But exhaustion soon overcame him, and he slipped into a dreamless sleep. The days after Jon's legitimization settled into a demanding routine. Winterfell was abustle with reconstruction. From the blacksmith's forge clanging late into the night to the lumber wagons arriving from northern forests. Each morning, Jon met with Robb, Roose Bolton, and other key figures to oversee the distribution of supplies. They had to balance Winterfell's own needs with those of outlying holds that had been ravaged by Ironborn or by the harsh roads. In the afternoons, Jon often trained in the courtyard with younger soldiers and squires. Some came from as far away as the last hearth, determined to learn swordplay and discipline from the man who had helped take King's Landing and Harrenhal. Jon found it humbling. He was no master knight like Ser Barristan Selmy, but the men looked up to him anyway. He taught them the stances his father had shown him, focusing on precision and defense over flashy strikes. Occasionally, Lady Catelyn asked Jon to accompany her on short rides to neighboring villages, distributing grain and hearing out peasant complaints. More than once, Jon noticed how the small folk stared at him with a mixture of awe and relief. The name Stark carried immense weight in the north, and the memory of Ned Stark was still revered. In time, villagers began to greet Jon openly as Lord Stark. He tried to correct them, I am only the king's brother, but they seemed uninterested in such fine distinctions. Meanwhile, letters arrived from King's Landing, bearing seals from Stannis Baratheon's new officials. Stannis, apparently, was contending with unrest in the Crownlands and the Reach, and needed the North to reaffirm certain clauses of the peace agreement. Robb shrugged off most of the demands, content to maintain a distant but formal relationship. Stannis can handle his own realm, Robb said. We have ours. What truly occupied Robb's mind, however, were the rumblings out of the Iron Islands. Balon Greyjoy had not yet bent the knee or acknowledged the North's independence. Reports trickled in that pockets of Ironborn continued to raid the western coasts. Perhaps they would never cease. The North lacked a strong fleet, and the winter storms would soon make seafaring even riskier. For now, the threat remained contained, though worrisome. On a chilly morning soon after, a raven arrived from the twins with fresh demands. Walder Frey had put them in writing, addressing Robb as Your Grace, but laden with subtle threats. He insisted that the original marriage vow, broken when Robb had wed Jane Westerling, still required compensation. He expected Edmure Tully to wed one of his granddaughters, which Edmure had reluctantly agreed to if the match was suitable. But in addition, Lord Walder's letter made it clear he wanted a Stark to marry into House Frey as well. And now that Jon was legitimized, he was apparently the prime candidate. Robb and Jon read the letter in the solar, Lady Catelyn looking on with dismay. He's more brazen than before, Robb muttered. He claims we owe him not just the keep in the Riverlands we already promised, but an alliance sealed in marriage. He's naming you, Jon, directly. Jon exhaled, staring at the parchment's careful script. Walder Frey demanded that Lord Jon Stark shall take to wife one of my granddaughters to be named upon negotiation, thereby forging a final and unbreakable bond between our esteemed houses. Do we have a way to refuse him without setting him off? Jon asked quietly. Catelyn's lips thinned. Not easily. Walder Frey is too proud. If we spurn him now, he'll cause trouble. He might not be able to field a great army, but the twins control the crossing of the Green Fork, which is vital for trade between the north and the rest of the realm. We can't just bypass him. He could levy tolls, hinder our merchants, or even spark uprisings among smaller Riverland houses. Robb slammed a fist on the table, though not forcefully. Damn the man. I should have known he'd come for us again once the war ended. We either buy him off with gold or give him this marriage, Bolton said, voice soft from the corner of the solar. His eyes, as always, were hard to read. In war, we bartered new treaties. In peace, we might barter more. But the old man seems fixated on a family bond. Lady Catelyn touched Jon's shoulder. Jon, I won't force you to do this. Neither will Robb. But you've seen how precarious our alliances can be. If you do not marry one of the Frey girls, we'll need to grant them something else of substantial value. Greater lands, a sworn oath for future political favors, or both. Jon set his jaw. I understand. We can't let the North suffer for this. If it must be marriage, I'll do it. Still, I'd like to see if there's another route. Perhaps Walder Frey would accept an alternative arrangement. Bolton cleared his throat. We could try offering him a betrothal to a cousin of the Tully line instead, to double down on that alliance. But from what I gather, Lord Walder specifically wants a Stark. He was cheated once when Robb broke his vow, and now he wants reparation. Silence fell in the solar. Robb massaged his brow. All right, let me write back to him, stating we are open to negotiations, but we need to meet in person, preferably at Riverrun or some neutral place. The crossing is too strategic for him to trap us. We'll see if we can talk him into a less demanding arrangement. If he insists, though... He trailed off, glancing at Jon. Jon nodded. Whatever is needed, I'll do it. Catelyn's gaze turned soft with sympathy. You shouldn't have to do this, Jon. You've already given up so much. But I admire your willingness to protect the North. They parted ways, and Jon left to patrol the walls with Ghost, trying to clear his head. Marriage to a stranger, a Frey no less, gnawed at his nerves, though he reminded himself that countless lords across Westeros faced similar political unions. He had yearned, once, for the freedom to choose a bride for love, but that had been long before war redefined everything. In the grand scheme, perhaps a loveless marriage was a small price to pay for peace. Still, a seed of resentment stirred within him, conflicting with the sense of duty that had always governed his choices. He thought of Ygritte, though in this new path of his life, he had never gone beyond the wall and fallen for that fierce wildling woman. The memory was more of a ghostly sense that something might have been, had he remained in the Watch. But he had chosen family instead. Now he would choose again, the North over himself. In the following week, a small council gathered in Winterfell's Great Hall to discuss final preparations for winter. The chill in the air grew sharper by the day, and reports came of the first real snowfall accumulating in the high passes near the Dreadfort. Despite the progress in rebuilding, the North was still recovering from war. Famine threatened if the harvest yields were not carefully managed. Wyman Manderley proposed shipping grain from White Harbor's stores inland, but the roads might freeze early, making transport difficult. The lords of the mountain clans offered to help keep passable routes open. During the discussions, Jon put forth the idea of sending a modest party of men, builders, and rangers to Castle Black, Eastwatch, and the Shadow Tower before the snows became too deep. Roose Bolton eyed him curiously, as did Lord Serwyn, but Robb backed Jon's request. We owe the Night's Watch some support, Robb said firmly. My father believed in protecting the realm from threats beyond the wall. Even if we're no longer part of the Seven Kingdoms, we remain neighbors. Better to bolster them now than regret it later if the wildlings become desperate or if other dangers loom. No one openly mentioned the White Walkers, for the stories of the others were considered legends by most. But Jon saw Lady Catelyn's brow furrow thoughtfully. She knew what Ned Stark had believed about the old stories. She had once dismissed them as superstitions, yet perhaps the war had taught her that anything was possible. It was settled. The North would send supplies north to the Watch before the roads became impassable. 100 men, volunteers from among the young archers and the braver swords, would accompany the shipments to strengthen the wall garrisons until spring. A letter would be dispatched to Castle Black to inform the Lord Commander, Jeor Mormont, if he still held that office, that the king in the north supported the ancient vow to guard the realms of men, albeit from an independent stance. Soon after, a raven returned from the twins. Walder Frey wrote that he would indeed come to Riverrun within the fortnight to discuss terms, provided that sufficient guarantees were made for his safety. The message practically dripped with suspicion, though it also implied that if the Starks spurned him, he might begin restricting passage across the twins. Robb ground his teeth when he read it aloud in the Solar. He's testing us. He wants to force our hand. But if meeting him will avert any new conflict, so be it. Catelyn pursed her lips. Riverrun is still in Tully hands. My brother Edmure can host Walder Frey while ensuring our neutrality. We should bring enough guards to avoid intimidation, but not so many as to threaten him. Bolton, leaning against a windowsill, added, I'll remain here, Your Grace, to oversee winter preparations. Lord Stark, he nodded to Jon with the faintest hint of a smile, may accompany you if you wish. After all, it's his fate that's being discussed. Robb looked at Jon. Will you come, brother? Jon gave a curt nod. Yes, I should hear the old man's demands myself. So it was agreed. Within days, Robb, Jon, Lady Catelyn, and a retinue of 300 loyal men prepared to leave Winterfell for Riverrun. They marched south, though the roads were growing muddy with the freeze-thaw cycle of early winter, making travel slow. Yet the journey also evoked memories of earlier campaigns. Only this time, there was no war to fight, no Lannister host lurking across the plains. A sense of relief mingled with apprehension for what Walder Frey might demand. Along the way, they stopped at villages where peasants greeted them with the new cry, Long live the king in the north! Long live House Stark! Such welcomes warmed Jon's heart, even as the cold winds bit at his face. Word had spread of Tywin Lannister's downfall, the crowning of Stannis in the south, and the North's independence. The scars of the war remained, but the people seemed hopeful. They reached the outskirts of Riverrun on a gray morning, the sky thick with clouds. Edmure Tully and a small party of knights rode out to greet them at the drawbridge. Edmure's face was alive with curiosity and relief. He embraced his sister, Lady Catelyn, and bowed to Robb. Then he smiled at Jon, blinking at the new name. So it's Lord Jon Stark now, Edmure said, looking Jon up and down. Forgive me, nephew, but that might take some getting used to. Jon dipped his head. It's new to me as well, uncle. They exchanged pleasantries. Then Edmure led them across the lowered portcullis into the familiar courtyard. Memories of war flickered in Jon's mind. The siege by the Lannisters, the tense nights planning battle strategies. Now the banners of Tully, silver trout on red and blue, fluttered in the wind, and the castle's towers seemed peaceful once more. Inside, Edmure had prepared a welcome feast with warm stews, fresh bread, and casks of ale. Robb, Jon, Lady Catelyn, and the northern bannermen settled around a long table. Edmure explained that Walder Frey's party was expected tomorrow. The old lord was traveling slowly, accompanied by a large retinue of his brood and guards. No doubt a show of his importance, Edmure remarked wryly. He wants everyone to see how big his house has grown. Robb scowled. I only hope he doesn't attempt any treachery in my uncle's halls. He won't, Edmure reassured them. I may not like Lord Walder, but he's not fool enough to commit violence in front of half the North's strength. Besides, I have men stationed on every wall. If he tries anything, we'll lock him up with the fish in the moat. That drew a rumble of laughter around the table. Even Lady Catelyn smirked faintly. Still, we'll keep our guard up, she said. The next day dawned with a cold drizzle that made the stone walls glisten darkly. By mid-morning, horns announced Lord Walder Frey's approach. From Riverrun's battlements, Jon watched as a column of Frey men wound along the muddy road, a forest of banners featuring the twins. Horses snorted in the damp, and at the procession's head, He glimpsed a large carriage swaying precariously, that presumably held Walder Frey. The portcullis was raised, and they entered in a slow shuffle. Walder Frey emerged with help from 2 attendants. Age had withered him further since Jon had last seen him at the Twins. His wrinkled skin sagging, eyes watery with cunning. But his voice remained sharp as ever. "King Robb," Walder Frey said in a rasping tone, leaning on a cane. "You look well. And Lady Catelyn, dear? So nice to see you again. That's what, the 4th time? 5th? He cackled. "I lose count." Catelyn gave a stiff curtsy. "Lord Walder, Riverrun welcomes you, so long as you come in peace." "I in peace. For now," Walder Frey said, flashing a gap-toothed grin that belied the threat under the surface. His gaze roved, landing on Jon. The old man's eyes brightened with malicious amusement. "And here's the bastard-turned Lord, Jon Stark. That's quite the climb, boy. Let's see how you handle it." Jon refused to bristle. "I handle what I must," he said calmly. Walder snorted. "We'll see." Edmure Tully greeted the Frey entourage with forced politeness and had them escorted to a suite of rooms overlooking the courtyard. After that, Walder was shown to the great hall, where a midday meal waited. The tension among those at the high table was nearly tangible. Frey men glared at Stark men, as if remembering the many slights and resentments that had built up over the course of the war. Finally, Robb cleared his throat. "Lord Walder, we are gathered to resolve the matter of our alliance. You have pressed for additional compensation beyond what was agreed." Walder's lips peeled back. "I only press for what was promised. The king in the north vowed to wed one of my girls in exchange for crossing at the Twins. Then he broke that vow, wedding some Westerling chit. A humiliating slight for my house. You offered new terms, lands, a match with Edmure Tully. Well, Edmure has dragged his feet, but now he's here. As for the rest—" "Stop," Edmure interjected, flushed. "I have not refused your granddaughter. We simply never met. Walder waved a knobby hand. Yes, we'll get to it. She's a pretty one, you'll see. But there's also the matter of a Stark. Since your king, in his wisdom, decided to break faith, we want another Stark to take a Frey wife. And look, here we have a fresh new Stark. The bastard, Jon." A low murmur rippled among the assembled. Robb's jaw tightened. "We have not refused that, my lord. But perhaps a different arrangement might serve us better. The North stands as its own kingdom now. We can offer trade agreements or a seat on our council. You'd have the ear of the king in the North." Walder slammed his cane on the floor with surprising strength. "I want blood, King Robb. I want my lineage tied to yours. A seat on your council, Faye. That's not half so important as having a Stark bridegroom for one of my lovely brood." His gaze traveled to Jon, sly and unyielding. "So here's my demand. Let Jon Stark wed one of my granddaughters. We can name which one later, some might be a bit too young yet, but there are choices aplenty. In return, you get permanent free crossing at the Twins, no tolls, and I'll consider my grievance settled. Without that, you'll pay dearly for every wagon that tries to cross, and I might permit certain bandits to roam free on the roads." Jon felt an icy knot in his belly. His worst suspicions about Frey's intransigence were confirmed. He glanced at Robb, whose knuckles were white on the table's edge. Beside him, Lady Catelyn's face was set in stone, though her eyes flashed. Edmure tried to interject with a calmer suggestion. "Lord Walder, surely we can find a balanced solution. The Tully match might well satisfy your desire for connection. If I take your granddaughter to wife, that will bind our houses." That's separate," Walder snapped. "You're Tully, not Stark. I want a wolf in my family. I was promised one once, and by the gods, I'll have one still." Silence descended. Jon slowly exhaled. There was no subtlety to Walder's demand. The old man wanted the alliance sealed with a marriage, and nothing less. Robb's voice broke the hush, filled with quiet menace. "You do realize, Lord Walder, that you speak to the king in the North. I could simply deny you and dare you to harass our roads. Then we'd settle this as we should have long ago, with steel. Walder's watery eyes regarded Robb with mock sympathy. Ah, but you're tired of war, aren't you, boy? The North is battered. Winter's coming. Do you truly wish to start another conflict just to avoid one marriage? Or will you bend enough to secure peace? Lady Catelyn placed a hand on Robb's arm, as if to restrain him from lashing out. Robb closed his eyes for a moment, then drew a slow breath. No, I do not wish another war, he admitted. Walder smirked, tapping his cane. Then let's be friends, Your Grace. Let me see my granddaughter wed to your half-brother, and we'll be done. We needn't drag this out. All eyes turned to Jon. He drew himself up. If that is what is required for peace, I will do my duty. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. Walder Frey chuckled, the sound wet and unpleasant. Good. That's the spirit, lad. He glanced about. Shall we sign a betrothal contract? I can name the girl when she's of age, or I can produce one of my granddaughters right now. There's Roslyn, there's fair Valda, there's... Lady Catelyn stood abruptly. We do not need you to parade them like cattle, she said coldly. We can negotiate specifics. But for now, an agreement in principle may suffice. Robb nodded, swallowing his anger. Aye, let's draft the formal terms. Edmure Tully will wed your granddaughter, as previously discussed. Jon Stark will wed one of your granddaughters of appropriate age within the year or as soon as we finalize details. In return, you grant free passage across the Twins for all Northern and Riverland travelers and forswear any hostility. Is that correct? Walder grinned, revealing discolored teeth. Aye, that's correct enough for now. Let's get it in ink. The tension remained thick, but the negotiations began in earnest. Maesters took notes. Catelyn and Edmure hammered out various details about dowries, lands, and the number of retinue. Walder added demands for minor titles in the Riverlands, which Edmure mostly acquiesced to. Jon remained silent as the betrothal details were spelled out. His name in bold script, stating that he would wed a granddaughter of Lord Walder Frey to be specified. The old man refused to commit to exactly which granddaughter, as if that gave him leverage. Watching this, Jon felt hollow. His life had been a chain of vows and sacrifices, leaving the Night's Watch, fighting in battles, standing at Robb's side. Now here he was, bartering his future for a peace that might prevent more bloodshed. Logically, he knew it was the right thing to do. In his heart, though, it felt like yet another piece of himself was being pledged away. At last, the contract was drawn up, sealed with wax bearing the sigils of House Stark, House Tully, and House Frey. Walder Frey seemed delighted, satisfied to have cornered the Starks into fulfilling a vow. Edmure forced a thin smile, though the betrayal in his eyes was plain. He would have to marry a woman he barely knew. Robb's face was stony, and Catelyn's expression unreadable. When it was done, Walder rose creakily, leaning on his cane. Well, that's settled. Now I'd like some supper, if you don't mind, Tully. Something warm. Edmure forced a courteous bow. We have a chamber prepared for you to dine and rest, Lord Walder. I'll show you personally. They shuffled out, leaving Robb, Jon, and Catelyn in the now quiet Great Hall. A few guards lingered at the doors. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Robb hurled the quill he held onto the table. That snake, he spat. How I loathe him. Jon said nothing, only rested his palms on the table's edge, staring at the fresh ink that sealed his fate. Catelyn's voice was hushed with regret. I'm sorry, Jon. I never wanted this for you. He took a breath, trying to steady the swirl of emotion. It's all right. We need peace. Robb turned to him, eyes blazing with mixed anger and sadness. You've done more than your share, brother. I'll not forget it. When the time comes, we'll do our best to make sure the match is at least tolerable, that you're not shackled to someone you despise. Jon nodded. Thank you. But he knew deep down that this was a matter of fortune, not of will. The Freys would pick whichever granddaughter gave them the greatest advantage. He could only hope it was someone mild or at least willing to find a peaceful coexistence. Robb exhaled. This will help secure the roads through the Twins, keep trade flowing. The North can't afford another blockade. Winter's harsh enough without our merchants being gouged or turned away. Catelyn placed a hand on Jon's arm. We'll make sure to set your wedding in Winterfell if you wish. On your terms as much as possible. I appreciate that, Jon said, voice quiet. He didn't trust himself to say more. With that, they retired. Riverrun's corridors seemed gloomier than before, as if the price of peace had cast a pall. Outside, the drizzle turned to sleet, rattling against the castle's shutters. Jon found a small hearth in the chamber he'd been assigned and built a fire, feeling the chill seep into his bones. Ghost curled by his feet, offering silent company. He stared into the flames, seeing fleeting images of a life he'd never have. One where he might choose freely who to love, or even remain a black-cloaked brother defending the wall. Instead, he was now Jon Stark, the king's brother, bound to a Frey bride. A step toward ensuring a stable north, yes, but the cost felt heavier than he expected. Over the next few days, Walder Frey continued to strut about Riverrun as though he owned the place, though he took care to show some courtesy in front of Lady Catelyn and Robb. He often reminded people that soon my dear granddaughter would wed a Stark, smiling as if the entire realm should applaud him. His brood, grandsons, granddaughters, bastards, and assorted nieces and nephews, swelled the corridors with Frey colors. Edmure and the promised bride, Rosalind Frey, were introduced. She was a pleasant, shy girl who seemed terrified of disappointing her family. Edmure, to his credit, treated her kindly, though awkwardly. Jon was spared immediate introduction to whichever granddaughter Walder had in mind for him. Walder claimed he was still deciding. The implication was that he might choose one of the younger ones who had not reached womanhood, forcing Jon to wait. Or he might spring an adult granddaughter on him at the last moment. No one could say. Robb, though furious, reminded Jon that once the Freys left, at least the arrangement was sealed. The North would have its free passage. Walder's men would go back to the twins, and the realm might enjoy some stability. Edmure would handle the wedding preparations for his own match, which would occur in the Riverlands come spring. As for Jon's, the contract stipulated a year to finalize the details, meaning the ceremony might not happen until the following autumn, giving them a little time. Finally, with all the documents signed and the arrangement confirmed in the presence of multiple witnesses, Walder Frey departed Riverrun. His retinue snaked along the road, headed back to the twins. Jon watched from the battlements, arms folded, as the columns of Freys vanished into the distance. He felt no joy, only a somber resignation. The next day, Robb announced that they would return to Winterfell promptly. There was little else to keep them in Riverrun. Edmure and Rosalind Frey would remain behind to get better acquainted, while Lady Catelyn would travel with Robb and Jon north, torn between her desire to aid her brother's budding match and her sense of responsibility to the north. In the end, duty to Winterfell won out, so they began the journey back, crossing the same muddy roads in reverse. The weather grew colder each day, the skies more leaden. Once, they encountered a light snowfall that drifted lazily from the clouds, dusting the travelers' cloaks in white. The men muttered that the true snows might not be far behind. By the time they reached Moat Cailin, the wind had turned biting. The swampy terrain around the ruined fortress was crusted with a thin layer of ice. Robb's outriders reported no signs of hostiles, no ironborn raiders, no brigands. Even so, the men kept a cautious watch. At last, Winterfell appeared on the horizon, smoke curling from the chimneys. As they passed through the gates, stable hands rushed to take their horses. Jon dismounted, wincing at sore muscles. He and Robb made a quick tour of the courtyard, greeting the guards and inquiring about any new developments. They learned that Lord Wyman Manderley had visited in their absence, leaving word that White Harbor's grain shipments to the Wall were proceeding. Several villages had reported sightings of small wildling groups near the coastline, possibly refugees who'd crossed the seas in stolen boats. Nothing too alarming yet. Roose Bolton greeted them in the Great Hall. He offered a curt bow to Robb. "Your Grace, I trust negotiations with Lord Frey went as well as could be expected?" Robb's expression soured. "They went as we assumed, Jon is bound to marry a Frey for the sake of peace. Bolton's pale eyes flicked to Jon. My condolences, my lord, but you've secured our southern border for the time being. Jon inclined his head stiffly. Yes, that's what matters. Bolton continued. We've made progress here in your absence. The stonemasons have nearly finished repairing the eastern walls, and the outlying farms have stocked their grain stores ahead of winter. There are still concerns about the Greyjoys. Some fishing villages near the Stony Shore fear raids. Also, a raven came from Castle Black. They thanked us for the supply shipments we arranged. They say the men are in dire need of warm clothing and furs, though. Then we'll see about sending them more, Robb said, rubbing his beard. We have a surplus of hides, do we not? Bolton nodded. Yes, though tanning them may take time, but we'll do what we can. That evening, a subdued warmth settled over the castle. The traveling was done, and the north was as secure as they could make it. Jon retired early to his chamber, physically tired yet restless in spirit. Ghost sensed his unease, nuzzling Jon's hand as if to comfort him. Jon thought of the future, of a Frey wife, of the responsibilities that came with the Stark name, and, above all, of the uncertain threats that winter might bring. That night, he slept fitfully, his dreams haunted by images of a massive snowscape and an ancient horn echoing in the darkness. He saw shapes moving in the blizzard, pale figures with eyes like blue starlight. He dreamed of the wall cracking under a black sky, of ravens swirling overhead. Ghost whined in the dream, warning him, but no voice answered, only the wind's hollow moan. He awoke shivering, heart hammering. Dawn's first light filtered through the shutters, revealing the day was bright but cold. After dressing hurriedly, he strode out into the courtyard. The work of the day had already begun. Men hauling timber, stable hands feeding horses. He found Robb near the armory, conferring with a steward about inventory. Robb caught sight of Jon's troubled face. Something wrong. Jon hesitated. Just uneasy dreams. Robb offered a sympathetic smile. I know the feeling. War leaves an imprint. I often dream of battle. But come, we have to plan for winter caravans. The snows won't wait. They walked together to the great tower that served as a vantage point over the castle. From up there, they could see Winterfell's rooftops blanketed in frost. Farther out, the naked trees of the Wolfswood stood stark against the pale sky. It was beautiful in a desolate way. As they spoke of caravans and supply routes, a messenger arrived, breathless from riding all night. He handed a sealed letter to Robb with trembling hands. Robb frowned at the seal, Dragonstone. Breaking it open, he read quickly, eyes narrowing. What is it? Jon asked. Robb exhaled in frustration. A summons. King Stannis requests my presence in King's Landing. He says it's urgent, a matter that concerns the realm as a whole, including the north. Something about the Tyrells possibly rearming or forging alliances. He claims if we don't coordinate, the realm could fall back into chaos. Jon felt a flash of dread. He's not demanding fealty again, is he? Robb shook his head. He acknowledges our independence, but says as brother kings we must keep lines of communication open. He wants me to come south, or send a high representative to discuss certain pressing issues. A cold wind whistled over the tower, stirring their cloaks. Robb's jaw set. I'm loath to leave the north again, especially with winter bearing down. But if I ignore Stannis, he might take offense. We can't afford a war with the Iron Throne right now. We're still rebuilding. Jon studied Robb's face. Do you want me to go in your stead? Robb's eyes flicked to him. You're my brother, a Stark, and one of my chief advisors. Stannis might accept you as my representative. But are you prepared to leave the north again so soon? You've barely settled. Jon felt the tug of duty. If it spares you the journey and keeps Stannis appeased, yes. Ghost and I can make the trip. It won't be easy, but I'll do whatever is needed. Robb paced a few steps. I'll consider it. It might be best to send you and perhaps a small retinue, someone like Lord Manderley or Lord Glover to lend weight. It's safer that way too. If King's Landing stirs up trouble, the North still has me here to hold it. Let Stannis posture all he likes. We'll respond with courtesy, not fear." Jon nodded. "As you wish, your grace." A half-smile touched Robb's lips. "Stop calling me that. You're my brother. In private, at least you can call me by my name." Jon's own lips curved in a faint grin. "All right, Robb." They stood there in silence for a moment, gazing out over the ramparts. The wind carried the faint smell of pine from the wolfswood. "A new chapter begins," Robb said softly. "The Frey alliance, winter's approach, Stannis' demands. I can't shake the feeling that we're perched on the edge of something larger. The war we fought might be nothing compared to what's coming." Jon shivered, remembering his dream of white shadows and hollow winds. He placed a hand on the cold stone of the tower wall. "If trouble comes, we'll face it together as Starks." Robb nodded, eyes distant. "Yes, as Starks." The following week saw a flurry of preparations. Robb publicly announced that Jon Stark would travel to King's Landing as the North's envoy, accompanied by Lord Wyman Manderly and a small guard of trusted men. The idea was to show respect without leaving the North vulnerable. Catelyn voiced her concern. She had once lost her husband to that city's treachery. But Robb assured her that times were different, and that Stannis, though harsh, was more honorable than Joffrey or Cersei. Still, the roads were growing worse. Snow fell intermittently, turning the King's Road into a slush of mud and ice. They would have to travel slowly. Jon spent his days gathering supplies, ensuring the horses had proper winter gear, and checking that each guard was equipped with warm cloaks and boots. Lord Manderly brought along crates of preserved fish and bread to gift to the new court, a gesture of goodwill. One crisp morning, as the party assembled in Winterfell's courtyard, Robb and Lady Catelyn came to see them off. Ghost stood beside Jon, while Manderly's men wrangled loaded mules. Snow fluttered down, swirling in eddies around the horses' hooves. Robb clasped Jon's hand, then pulled him into a brief embrace. "Take care, brother. I trust you to handle Stannis with caution. Don't let him bully you into anything that compromises the North." Jon nodded. "I'll be careful. If he tries to overreach, I'll send word by Raven immediately." Catelyn's voice wavered. "King's Landing can be a nest of vipers, even with Stannis on the throne. Watch out for intrigues. Littlefinger, Varys, anyone who might resent the North's independence." "I will," Jon promised. He mounted his horse, checking that Ghost was comfortable trotting alongside. Manderly, mounted on a sturdy mare, bowed to Robb. "Farewell, your grace. We'll bring back a fair report of the South." Robb raised a hand. "Gods be with you all. Travel safe." With that, the gates opened, and the small column rode out. Snow dusted the fields, and a pale winter sun struggled to pierce the gray clouds overhead. Jon guided his horse down the old familiar road, memories of the last time he had left Winterfell flickering through his mind. Then, he had been off to join the Night's Watch. Now, he was returning to King's Landing as an envoy for an independent North, legitimized and recognized as a Stark. The world had turned upside down in the span of a few years. They traveled steadily southward. The first week was grueling, as the snows thickened and they had to break through crusted drifts. Manderly grumbled about the cold, though he was cheerful enough whenever they made camp, quick to share flasks of strong White Harbor spirits. Jon spent nights reading over the letters Robb had given him, formal statements of the North's position on trade, alliances, and any proposed laws from Stannis' court. Whenever they stopped in a holdfast or village, they found people wary but respectful. Some recognized Jon as the king's brother. Others looked askance at the white direwolf prowling among them. Yet they always offered what shelter they could. The watchers on the walls typically lowered their drawbridges without question when they saw the Stark banners. By the second week, they crossed into the Riverlands. The storms here were less severe, though the roads remained slushy. They encountered the occasional merchant heading north, complaining of frozen routes. Lord Manderly halted more than once to help push wagons out of the mire, earning grateful thanks and a chance to exchange news. Rumors circulated that the Tyrells had raised an army in the Reach to secure their borders, uncertain of Stannis' intentions. Some said Storm's End was garrisoned by Stannis' most loyal bannermen. Others whispered that the gold cloaks in King's Landing had grown resentful of Melisandre's red priests patrolling the streets. Jon gleaned that the city was still a cauldron of tension. Finally, after many days on the King's Road, they drew near the Trident, the scene of so many old battles. The twins lay to the west, but they had no need to cross there, having chosen a route that bypassed Walder Frey's direct influence. Instead, they waded across a shallower ford under the watchful eyes of local lordlings. The going was slow, but they made progress toward the Crownlands. As they neared the outskirts of King's Landing, the land grew more populous. Small villages dotted the road, though many had battered gates and watchtowers. War had touched these lands repeatedly. People eyed the Stark banners with curiosity and a hint of fear, memories of the Northern Army that had helped dethrone Joffrey. At last, they saw the city's walls rising on the horizon, the muddy waters of the Blackwater rush flowing beneath. The skyline looked as Jon remembered. Tall walls, spikes, the Red Keep perched on the heights. A swirl of conflicting emotions hit him. He had last been here for the final assault with Robb, toppling Joffrey's regime and helping Stannis seize power. Now he returned as a diplomat, not a conqueror. They approached the gates, where gold cloaks in Stannis' stag and flaming heart livery stood watch. The guards seemed surprised to see a northern party in the depths of winter, but they recognized the heraldry and grudgingly raised the gates. A city official bustled forward to greet them. Lord Jon Stark. Jon introduced himself, dismounting carefully. I come as an envoy of Robb Stark, king in the north, to treat with King Stannis. The official, a small man with watery eyes, bobbed his head. Yes, my lord. We've been informed of your expected arrival. Please, your men can stable their horses just inside. We'll escort you to the Red Keep. Jon motioned for Lord Manderly and a half-dozen guards to join him. The rest would find lodgings in the city's inns or the courtyard near the keep. Ghost patted at Jon's heel, causing the official to cringe slightly. Still, the man did not object. Word must have spread about the direwolves that fought alongside the Northern Army. Inside, the streets were as busy as ever, though the air held a sour tang of smoke and uncollected waste. King's Landing had never been a clean city, and winter had not improved its odor. People parted hastily when they saw the wolf sigil, remembering the sacking and partial burning of the city not long ago. Some gold cloaks patrolled in pairs, eyes scanning for trouble. Every so often, Jon saw a red-robed priest of R'hllor standing on a street corner, chanting prayers. Some passers-by sneered, others bowed piously. They wound their way up the hill of Aegon toward the Red Keep's gates. Jon remembered crossing these very streets in the chaos of battle, the reek of blood and wildfire in the air. Now, the city bore fewer scars, though certain buildings remained blackened shells. At the Red Keep's main gates, more gold cloaks challenged them. The official pointed to Jon, explaining the purpose of their visit. After some hurried conversation, they were ushered inside the outer ward. Jon's gut twisted. Some part of him recalled Ned Stark's last steps here. He pushed the memory aside. They were led into the great hall. Torches burned on the walls, and the Iron Throne loomed at the far end, a twisted mass of swords. At its base stood King Stannis Baratheon, severe in a plain black tunic with the flaming heart of R'hllor embroidered on the breast. Melisandre, her red robes trailing on the floor, stood to one side, her bright eyes flicking over the newcomers. Davos Seaworth was there as well, sporting a new beard that had gone mostly gray. Jon bowed. Lord Manderly did the same, albeit stiffly. The North typically did not kneel for Southern kings anymore, but courtesy demanded some gesture of respect. Stannis' dark gaze flicked to Ghost, who stood by Jon's side, silent and watchful. So, Stannis said in a voice like iron scraping, the envoy from the north arrives at last. I had begun to wonder if winter had swallowed you. Jon rose from his bow. We faced difficult roads, your grace, but we are here to hear your concerns, and to represent the king in the north's position. Melisandre stepped forward, her ruby necklace catching the torchlight. The flames showed us your arrival, Jon Snow. Jon Stark, she corrected, voice liquid and confident. Much has changed since we last met. Jon tried not to dwell on her unsettling presence. Yes, much has changed. The North has recognized my brother Robb as king, and we understand your own claim to the Iron Throne stands. We come to find common ground. Stannis nodded curtly. Good. Ser Davos will show you to your quarters. We'll meet in council tomorrow. There is much to discuss. Rumors of discontent among the Tyrells, potential moves by Dorne, and the tension in the Vale. The realm is not yet at peace. Davos stepped forward and offered a respectful nod. If you please, my lord, follow me. Jon, Manderly, and their guards were guided through the keep's corridors. The place felt both familiar and alien. He remembered it from the immediate aftermath of the siege, though now it was filled with Stannis's men. The gold and crimson of the Lannisters had been stripped away, replaced with black and red banners of the Baratheon Flaming Heart. Some corners still showed signs of fire damage. Davos led them to a modest suite of chambers overlooking an inner courtyard. It's not the most lavish set of rooms, he apologized, but we're short on space with so many new officials. I hope it suffices. Lord Manderly inspected the rooms. This will do, sir. We thank you for the hospitality. Davos gave Jon a small, conspiratorial smile. So you're truly a Stark now, in name as well as blood? Jon returned the smile. Yes, my brother saw to it. You don't seem surprised. I always knew there was more of Ned Stark in you than you realized, Davos said quietly. I wish you luck, my lord. These halls are not known for their honesty. With that warning, Davos departed. Jon and Manderly settled in, instructing the guards where to stow their gear. Ghost sniffed around the corners, tail swishing. A faint chill penetrated even here in the south, though it was nowhere near as cold as Winterfell. Manderly rubbed his hands together. I'm famished, my lord. Shall we see what passes for a feast in Stannis' court? Jon nodded. Let's. We need to keep our wits about us, though. I suspect tomorrow's council might be challenging. They dined in a lesser hall, where a handful of lords loyal to Stannis also gathered, Stormlanders, a few Crownlanders, and men from Dragonstone. The fare was simple: fish stew, black bread, and watered wine. Stannis, apparently, did not indulge in extravagance. Lord Manderly looked vaguely disappointed but made the best of it, regaling some minor lords with stories of White Harbor's bounty. Jon kept mostly silent, observing. He saw how the men regarded him with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. Here was the man who had helped Robb Stark dethrone the Lannisters, who wore the name Stark yet once wore black for the Night's Watch. He offered polite replies to any who asked about the North, and made no mention of the White Walkers. It would do no good to spout legends. Not here. Eventually, they retired to their chambers for the night. Jon found sleep elusive, his thoughts tangled in the questions that tomorrow's council would bring. He also felt a pang recalling King's Landing streets. He had never been fond of them, yet he missed the presence of Robb, Grey Wind, and the sense of security that came from being among friends. Ghost curled at his side, and that was some comfort. At dawn, a steward rapped on the door, summoning them to the council room. Jon washed quickly, pulled on his warmest tunic, and buckled Longclaw at his hip. Lord Manderly joined him, eyes heavy-lidded from a poor night's rest. Together with two guards, they followed the steward through winding hallways until they reached a large chamber lined with heavy drapes and lit by tall windows. Inside, King Stannis sat at the head of a table, Melisandre at his right. On his left was a stern-faced general, likely one of his Stormland captains. A few other lords ringed the table. Jon took a seat near the far end, Manderly beside him. A hush fell. Stannis wasted no time. We'll begin. Lord Jon Stark, Lord Manderly, I've called you here because the realm is not stable. The Tyrells are massing forces near the Mander, uncertain whether to acknowledge my rule wholeheartedly. They aided the Lannisters before, and though I have pardoned them, they remain aloof. Meanwhile, the Vale under Lord Robert Arryn is largely controlled by Peter Baelish, an unscrupulous man who might tilt the Vale in any direction if it profits him. Dorne is quiet, but that worries me more. They could be plotting to break free as you did." Manderley exchanged a glance with Jon. Then Jon spoke. "Your Grace, how does this concern the North? We have declared independence and hold no designs on the South. We do not wish to meddle in your quarrels, so long as our boundaries and trade are respected." Stannis's jaw clenched. A fracturing realm is everyone's problem. If the Vale or Dorne separate, or if the Tyrells decide to crown their own king, we could see multiple wars that might spill into your lands. The Riverlands could become a battleground again. Moreover, I need the North's cooperation if I must quell rebellions swiftly. Cooperation that might include passage through certain territories or the provisioning of supplies. Jon frowned. "We have no interest in waging new wars. Yet you ask us to help you subdue other regions if they defy your claim." Stannis's dark eyes bored into Jon. "I ask you to keep faith with the idea of a united realm, or at least a stable one. Even as an independent kingdom, you benefit if the South is not ablaze with constant conflict." Lord Manderley cleared his throat. "True, constant warfare in the South would disrupt our trade routes. But we cannot simply promise troops, if that's what you imply. The North is not recovered from the last war." Stannis pressed his lips together. "I do not ask for your men to fight my battles, not unless we strike a separate alliance. But I do ask that you do not hinder me, that you do not extend your own alliances to rebel lords, and that if necessary, you allow my army's safe passage through the Riverlands." Jon straightened. "The Riverlands are allied with the North as part of our broader coalition. We can't simply grant you free rein to march through them. Their lords might see that as a betrayal of their sovereignty." One of the southern lords growled. "Then they should acknowledge King Stannis as the rightful king, and all would be resolved." Manderley shot back. "We recognized no such claim. We recognized Robb Stark, king in the North. We're not about to relinquish our autonomy just to please you." Tension spiked around the table. Stannis raised a gauntlet hand for silence. "Enough. I'm not here to relitigate the North's independence. That is settled, though I personally find it galling." He paused, clearing his throat. "But the fact remains, if the Tyrells or Baelish or Dorne rise up, I may need to move armies through the Riverlands quickly. I want your assurance that the North will not interfere, that you will instruct your Riverland allies not to bar my way. In return, I'll promise not to levy taxes or place garrisons in those lands beyond what's necessary to keep order." Jon's mind raced. He recalled Robb's instructions. Maintain peaceful relations with Stannis, but do not compromise the independence or safety of the North or the Riverlands. "I can relay your request to my brother. Ultimately, the final decision rests with him and the lords of the Riverlands. They may not welcome southern troops crossing their lands, but we can consider a limited arrangement if certain conditions are met. Chiefly that the local lords are respected, and no forced quartering is done." Stannis gave a curt nod. "Very well, that's a start. I also have concerns about the Iron Islands. Balon Greyjoy remains defiant. If I choose to bring him to heel, will the North stand aside?" Jon blinked. "The Iron Islands attacked the North during the war. We have our own grievances with Balon. If you move against him, we might well coordinate or at least not hinder you. But we will not bend to your command. If we coordinate, it's as equals or not at all." A tense silence followed. Melisandre's gaze flitted from Jon to Stannis. The king rubbed his stubbled jaw, frustration plain. "Equality, yes," he said at last. "The North is large if sparsely populated. If you want the Greyjoy threat ended, I can muster ships to strike Pike. Your brother can rally land forces. We could crush them together, but we would need a formal alliance for that." Lord Manderley raised an eyebrow. A formal alliance might mean shared spoils, or recognition of each other's claims. "Are you prepared to sign such a treaty, King Stannis?" Stannis's mouth twisted. "If it means stabilizing the realm, yes. I do not relish dealing with rebellious lords, but I also cannot allow them to slice away my kingdom piecemeal. Will your brother accept that? Or does he prefer to remain aloof?" Jon leaned forward, heart pounding. This was precisely the sort of entanglement Robb had warned him about. An alliance with Stannis might draw the North into southern wars, but ignoring the Greyjoy threat would leave their coasts vulnerable. "I will present the proposal to Robb," Jon said carefully. "We'll weigh the pros and cons." The rest of the council delved into details. Jon and Manderly had to navigate a minefield of Stannis' demands, from trade tariffs to safe passage, from potential alliances to the matter of southern refugees who might flee north if new unrest broke out. Jon made no firm commitments beyond agreeing to bring these points to Robb. After hours of wrangling, Stannis dismissed them with a terse command to return the next day. Davos Seaworth walked them out of the chamber, an apologetic tilt to his shoulders. "His Grace is under a great deal of pressure," Davos murmured. "He means well, but the realm is frayed. A single spark could set it aflame again." Jon nodded, grim. "We'll do what we can, but the North is wary. We've lost too much in these wars." Davos sighed. "I understand. Let's hope cooler heads prevail." They parted, Jon and Manderly returning to their quarters, where they found a simple meal waiting. Some bread, cheese, and watered wine. They ate in silence, both weighed down by the day's negotiations. Finally, Manderly rubbed his temples. "Lord Jon, we should draft a letter to Robb as soon as possible, detailing Stannis' demands. He'll need time to consider them before we give any answers." Jon agreed. They spent the evening writing, penning a careful but thorough account of the discussions, including Stannis' talk of an alliance to subdue the Iron Islands and his request for rite of passage through the Riverlands. Jon added his personal observations. That Stannis seemed desperate to maintain a united front, that tension with the Tyrells and Vale might explode at any moment, and that Melisandre's presence suggested there could be an even deeper agenda at play. After sealing the letter, Jon found a gold cloak captain willing to dispatch a swift rider to the north. With luck, the message would reach Winterfell in a few weeks, assuming the roads were passable. That night, Jon walked the halls of the Red Keep, Ghost at his side. Memories of the siege flitted in his mind, bodies in the corridors, the clang of steel, the stench of burning flesh. Now, the keep was quiet, though red priests glided through the shadows. He passed one praying by a brazier, chanting in a language he did not know. The flame in the brazier danced wildly, as if alive. He ascended a flight of stairs and emerged onto a balcony overlooking the city. Below, King's Landing sprawled, its lights flickering under the dark sky. The Blackwater Bay glimmered with faint starlight. Jon breathed the salty air, letting the wind cut through his cloak. It was warmer than Winterfell, but it carried a different chill, one of uneasy recollection. Ghost nudged Jon's hand, and Jon stroked the direwolf's fur absently. "I miss home," he whispered. "We have a year before the Frey wedding is forced on me. But if war breaks out again, everything might change. I just want the North to be safe." As if in answer, Ghost gazed out at the city, ears pricked. In the distance, a gull cried. Jon wondered if he would ever step away from these burdens. He remembered that once, the Night's Watch had been his calling, its vow to protect the realm from the things that lurked beyond the wall. Now he was tangled in the realm's politics, bound by a new oath to House Stark, a betrothal contract looming, and the king in the north relying on him. No, he thought, I can't step away. Duty. Always duty. He lingered there until the night deepened, then returned to his chambers, stepping over the threshold with a final glance at the corridor. Tomorrow, more council sessions awaited, more demands from Stannis, more tangled alliances. But he was Jon Stark now. He would endure, as the snows of winter endured the cold. Closing the door, he leaned against it, eyes shut. At least he could serve his family, uphold the Stark legacy. Whatever came, Frey marriages, southern wars, or the creeping threat in the far north, he would not falter. He would stand, as his father had taught him, and protect the realm he loved, whether or not it recognized the danger that might soon come knocking. In the quiet, Ghost settled at his feet. Jon knelt, pressing his forehead to the direwolf's. "We'll do our best," he murmured, letting the direwolf's warm breath ground him. "Always." And so, with winter's chill creeping across the land and uncertain storms gathering in the southern courts, Jon Stark prepared to face whatever trials the next dawn would bring. Torn between the North's fragile peace, the swirling intrigues of King's Landing, and the deep, distant knowledge that the truest enemy might yet lie beyond the wall, biding its time among the silent snows.